listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition, the second this week, of the most disruptive show covering news, politics, and events from across this United States we call America and the increasingly divided surface of our globe. In the Independent Corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together, that surely means you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Good morning, everybody. It's August 17th, the second day after we just lost our longest war. And let's get into COVID news. First up, in COVID cases, there are about 252,369. I'm going to read that. Over 250,000 new COVID cases reported in the United States yesterday. Also, over 1,000 new deaths, 1,016 new deaths. Over the past week, there have been an average of about 141,000 cases per day. That's an increase of 64% from the average taken 2 weeks earlier. 51% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and 60% of residents have received at least one dose. Both of those numbers up from yesterday. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected about 36,980,000 people across the United States, and it's killed 622,244 people. U.S. experts are expected to recommend COVID-19 vaccine boosters for Americans of all ages 8 months after they receive their second dose. Boosters will only be administered after the FDA formally approves the vaccine. This is, of course, after the clearance of those booster shots for the immunocompromised late last week. New Zealand has declared a nationwide lockdown after detecting its first COVID case in over 6 months. I remember we had conversations on the show last year. It might have been before we came on, actually. Although I think we had conversations with her, too. With Susie Wiles. It was like a scientist based down in New Zealand.
Yeah.
And basically, they're an island nation. So they're insular, but still, compare them to the United Kingdom or a country like that for a second. They basically have had many months without a single COVID case, single new COVID case in the country, No community transmission. It's just crazy compared to the rest of the world, a lot of it at least. In national news, yesterday, major U.S. oil companies sued the Biden administration for halting drilling auctions on federal land and waters this year. They state that the government is required by law to hold regular sales. During his campaign, Biden promised to stop issuing new leases to oil and gas companies as part of his agenda to combat climate change. His administration paused drilling auctions in January, pending review of the program's environmental impacts and value to taxpayers. Bob Dylan is now facing allegations of sexual abuse dating back 50 years to 1965, when a woman now accuses Dylan of plying her with drinks and drugs at the age of 12 and then molesting her for 6 weeks. His spokesperson has denied that, and I'm going to be honest, that's like a huge claim. This is so far after the fact. Yeah. Again, he's saying that he took her captive for 6 weeks. But maybe it's also just that Bob Dylan is an iconic musician and cultural hero, and therefore I'm loath to accept the idea that he might be guilty. But still, the point remains, it's so long after the fact. It's a huge claim, still worth hearing you out on it.
Yeah.
In international news, Biden's speech on Afghanistan came in yesterday. Jamarl, you're going to be playing clips extensively from this.
Several clips.
During your monologue.
Yeah.
And we're going to be talking about this at 8 o'clock and 9 o'clock. Well, Afghanistan in general.
In fact, we're probably going to be playing clips throughout the show.
Exactly.
Because it's a big deal. I mean, considering. And it's a massive speech, right? He had to give a speech. He was dragged back to the United States or dragged back to D.C. to give a speech. He had to explain why people are watching this place on fire that we spent $2 trillion to bolster over the last few years. So, yeah, it's a big deal.
If it's good with you, I'm going to try to cut headlines slightly short so that we have full time to play through those clips and because I want to get to it
you
sooner.
Have another one. Yeah, you have some too.
And I had one that I wanted to a clip that I wanted to play too. But mainly it's just, there's a lot to talk about here, and I want to get right to it because it's a big speech. Anyway, more headlines here. In Afghanistan, the Taliban has urged government officials to return to work. This is 2 days after they again took Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan. Evacuation flights have resumed from Kabul's airport, and there's reports of no music or very little music coming from the city. Also, women are reportedly scarce. In Earth and Science news, the first ever U.S. water shortage was declared yesterday on a reservoir supplying Arizona and Nevada. The states, which are both affected by drought, will begin to cut water use from the new year forward. Officials are blaming the problem on climate change, although I would argue there are other other sorts of human-caused errors, too, than just climate change. That's kind of broad brush to try to sweep all this stuff away with. Anyway, NASA's Perseverance Mars rover's first rock sample went missing. The metallic tube expected to hold the sample was examined and found empty. Basically, it bored into the ground to retrieve some rock and then took it inside its body machinery to process it. And then they thought it went well, and then it lost it. It just like vanished, and they think that it's not the machinery's fault, it's the rock's fault. Anyway, this would have been the first time they did this. It's a big deal. They're trying to create this long-term plan to basically repeatedly get pristine Martian soil back to Earth so they can analyze it. They're saying it's a huge step forward. Unfortunately, this first case, again, was completely bungled, apparently. NASA states that the collection targeting malfunctioned. Of course, also, like Austin says, this could be further proof of aliens, which we'll see.
We're not going to let them take anything from our soil.
Exactly. In business news, the man who popularized the game Sudoku has died at the age of 69 after seeing the game in a magazine under the name Number Place. Maki Kaji, that's his name, renamed it Sudoku and released it in a Japanese magazine in 1984. That's long before he saw the rise of the game to international popularity and success about 20 years ago. In about 2000. You ever play Sudoku, Jamarl?
Yeah, my mom used to love it.
Yeah, my brother and I play it quite frequently together. It's like a competitive, collaborative
back and forth
puzzle thing on the same puzzle.
I remember she used to really, really like it, and it got very popular at one point. I mean, a lot of people who are much, much younger may not remember it, but it got hugely popular.
Yeah.
So yeah.
We in fact, one of our favorite video games to play together is a Sudoku. We have like Thermo Sudoku, which is where the number is supposed to increase over time in these different lines. Anyway, we like to play it together. It's fun.
Very cool.
It is a good game. And with that, those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And again, like I said, I'm going to take us out to an early break. Not because we don't have enough to talk about, but because I want to get to the main distraction here, which is Biden's speech that came out yesterday. Again, America's longest war. We're in the process of pulling out. And we've lost it. And it's weird. But we're going to go to our break. We're going to come back and talk about it. Anyway, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Coming back talking about Biden's speech yesterday on the pullout from Afghanistan, the fate of the Afghan government, the rise of the Taliban, and more. That's going to be in Jamarl's monologue in the soapbox segment of the show, followed by a short back and forth between Jamarl and I, and a lot of clips from the speech, believe you me. Again, Fault Lines, be right back.
Fault Lines.
Radio Sputnik.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. We're getting a few things. Let's go this way first. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. We got the clips. Excellent. All right, so I want to get to some of the clips in Biden's speech yesterday. As Shane made the point, this war is over. It's been 20 years, $2 trillion, maybe $3 trillion, if not more. Hundreds of thousands of lives from the standpoint of Afghanis. I think there were 3,000 American lives lost, give or take. And that doesn't include the people who basically ate their gun in the way that Scott mentioned yesterday, basically committing suicide, vets and soldiers and whatnot. All sorts of training that we dumped into hundreds of thousands of Afghan forces, all sorts of money, weapons, Air Force, all of that stuff is still there. It's probably going to get sold. And the Taliban, who at one point never really controlled the entirety of the country, will most likely now be taking control of the entirety of the country. It's chaos. In fact, not just chaos, people are very freaked out, and a lot of people are trying to even leave the country. Joe Biden was very clear that there would not be scenes like they were in Vietnam and Saigon. And we had the clip yesterday, but I'm not going to play that clip again because I don't think I loaded it in the queue. But you heard it from yesterday, that basically this is not going to be another Vietnam. This is not going to be Saigon. We're not going to have people hanging off helicopters, et cetera, et cetera. And he was demonstratively wrong. In fact, you even had reports coming out of bodies or body mangled into the compartment of the mechanisms of the airplane as people were hanging on as they were trying to get away. So Joe Biden has the answer for this, right? The president of the United States pulls us out. And by the way, I applaud him for this. You should pull us out. This is still not justification to stay there forever under that motto. No, he pulls us out. And he has to come back and confront the American public and explain himself and explain how it turned out this way. And the rub of this speech is that it didn't do that. It didn't do that. It blames the Afghan people on some level, saying, oh, they're not willing to fight for this corrupt government. But on top of that, it misses this kind of basic point that people are making here, is that it's not the issue that you're pulling out. It's how it's taking place. And it's that part that seems to be entirely ignored in this speech. Let's play a few of these clips. So let's go to the first clip. The first clip is going to be General William Taylor. Now, he's trying to explain what took place. And he's asked a very basic question. I mean, Biden at this point has to explain himself. And so the question that he's asked is, was this a failure of planning or failure of intelligence? Let's hear Major General William D. Taylor.
General Taylor, was this a failure of intelligence or planning that led to the scenes we saw at the airport today?
When the scenes at the airport of everybody coming on
caused it to be shut down.
Yeah, what we know had happened at the airport was that there were a lot of Afghans that were trying to reported get out of the country. So I don't think that was a lack of planning. As we look at the coordination with those that were responsible for securing that, we'll look at our mission, though, as I talked earlier, is now that the airfield's open, is to make sure that it remains open. So like, as I said, we can continue expediting flights in and outbound.
But the quick fall of Kabul, was that a failure of intelligence?
I can't answer that.
Can't answer that. Can't answer that. Why can't you answer that? Is it a failure of intelligence or planning? Sounds like it's a little bit of both. Let's play the clip. Let's go into Biden now. Because Biden is the one, this is the meat and potatoes of it all. Because Biden, as he said, the buck stops with him. He's the person. He's the one that everyone is going to be looking at. Yes, Donald Trump might have said we're taking this out, but Biden is the one who decided to push it until September, supposedly to give himself more time to do so it can be done in an orderly fashion and not like this. So Biden has to explain himself. Biden is going to explain his reasoning and rationale for this. Let's play the clip.
The choice I had to make as your president was either to follow through on that agreement or be prepared to go back to fighting the Taliban in the middle of the spring fighting season. There would have been no ceasefire after May 1. There was no agreement protecting our forces after May 1. There was no status quo of stability without American casualties after May 1. There was only the cold reality of either following through on the agreement to withdraw our forces or escalating the conflict and sending thousands more American troops back into combat in Afghanistan, lurching into the third decade of conflict. I stand squarely behind my decision. After 20 years, I've learned the hard way that there was never a good time to withdraw U.S. forces. That's why we're still there. We were clear-eyed about the risks. We planned for every contingency, but I always promised the American people that I would be straight with you. The truth is, this did unfold more quickly than we had anticipated. So what's happened? Afghanistan political leaders gave up and fled the country. The Afghan military collapsed. sometime without trying to fight. If anything, the developments of the past week reinforced that ending U.S. military involvement in Afghanistan now was the right decision. American troops cannot and should not be fighting in a war and dying in a war that Afghan forces are not willing to fight for themselves.
That's such a slap in the face. We invade a country. We kill all of these people. We occupy that country, use it for geopolitical influence and everything else, and then turn around and say, hey, they're not willing to fight for the corrupt government. And don't take my word for it. Right here, Afghanistan files. One unidentified contractor told government interviewers he expected to dole out $3 million a day for projects in a single Afghan district roughly the size of a U.S. county. He once asked a visiting congressman whether the lawmaker could responsibly spend that kind of money back home. Quote, he said, hell no. Well, sir, that's what you've obligated us to spend, and I'm doing it for communities that live in mud huts and no windows. The gusher of aid Washington spent on Afghanistan gave rise to historic levels of corruption. And what the Afghanistan files makes the point very clear is that the public understood that the government was corrupt, understood that it was a puppet. And if you think about it, would you want to fight for a corrupt puppet government of the United States, of an occupying force? That's why this is such a slap in the face. Nobody told the U.S. to invade. Nobody told us to occupy. And now, after creating the military and everything else and propping up the government and spending all of this money in weapons and bases and everything else, Biden turns around and says, well, they're not willing to fight for themselves. So we're leaving. Yes, we should leave. Is this a great framing of argumentation? For an American audience, I suppose. Is it entirely honest? Not entirely. Let's go to the next one. Biden's, the buck stops with me, because this one explains why he did it, but this one goes into him justifying, this is why we're leaving, and you blame me for this.
I'm now the fourth American president to preside over war in Afghanistan. 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans. I will not pass this responsibility on to a 5th president. I will not mislead the American people by claiming that just a little more time in Afghanistan will make all the difference. Nor will I shrink from my share of responsibility for where we are today and how we must move forward from here. I am President of the United States of America, and the buck stops with me. I'm deeply saddened by the facts we now face, but I do not regret my decision to end America's war fighting in Afghanistan and maintain a laser focus on our counterterrorism missions there and other parts of the world. Our mission to degrade the terrorist threat of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and kill Osama bin Laden was a success. Our decades-long effort to overcome centuries of history and permanently change and remake Afghanistan was not, and I wrote and believed it never could be. I cannot and will not ask our troops to fight on endlessly in another country's civil war, taking casualties, suffering life-shattering injuries, leaving families broken by grief and loss. This is not in our national security interest. It is not what the American people want. It is not what our troops, who have sacrificed so much over the past 2 decades, deserve. I made a commitment to the American people when I ran for president that I would bring America's military involvement in Afghanistan to an end. While it's been hard and messy, and yes, far from perfect, I've honored that commitment.
You know, to give Biden credit for that, he did honor the commitment when I think some presidents would have flinched with the chaos that was taking place. By the same token, you did just spend a few minutes blaming the Afghan people and the Afghan government and military for not fighting for that government. And one last clip before we go back and forth with Shane. How many more? Because to me, this is the strongest framing of the argument for people who keep saying they want to stay. Marianne Williamson, somebody who I typically like, gets out and is basically arguing that the U.S. should stay there, that the women or the women in and of itself is enough of an excuse for the American military to basically continue to occupy the country. It is a very bizarre argument. It's as if she believes that women were somehow bettered by us radicalizing the country, or better in the various other countries when bombs are falling and whatnot. Does she believe that bombs somehow miss the women when they're being dropped or when we're invading? It's somewhat of a ludicrous argument. Afghanistan, also, just to point something out, it wasn't always this way. I know a lot of people like to think, oh, it's always this way. It was always a backwards country, et cetera, et cetera. I could show you images of women. There was a time where there was a chance for Afghanistan to go in somewhat of a different direction. It just wasn't in our interests for it to be that way. It's always weird hearing people talk about Afghanistan in these terms as if this is thousands of years, hundreds of years, as if there wasn't this moment where there was a radicalization of that country in order to push back against the Soviets, in order to give them their own Vietnam. But let's play the last clip, because I think this is the strongest framing of leaving. How many more dead Americans are you willing to spend for Afghanistan? How many more trillions of dollars? Give us the number in advance. Let's play the clip.
How many more generations of America's daughters and sons would you have me send to fight Afghanistan's civil war when Afghan troops will not? How many more lives, American lives, is it worth? How many endless rows of headstones at Arlington National Cemetery? I'm clear on my answer. I will not repeat the mistakes we've made in the past. Mistake of staying and fighting indefinitely in a conflict that is not in the national interest of the United States, of doubling down on a civil war in a foreign country, of attempting to remake a country through the endless military deployments of U.S. forces. Those are the mistakes we cannot continue to repeat, because we have significant vital interest in the world that we cannot afford to ignore.
Yes, I think that's true. Look, whatever I think of this speech, I have two thoughts of it, and they're almost existing simultaneously. And Shane, you can give me your take on it. There are elements of the speech that I think are very honest, and there are elements of the speech that I think are just lying. And some of that has to do with framing, I think. So when you get into this notion of should we leave? Yes, of course we should leave. Is what's taking place at the airport justification for us to stay? No, it's not. Was there always going to be some level of chaos and us leaving the country? Well, yeah, you've broken a country. You've basically tried to stick it together with super glue. And it was ensconced in corruption from the beginning to the end in a campaign where we basically lied to the American audience for decades, like flagrantly lying. And this just isn't my point of view. I mean, this is stuff that they were very clear on. All of the data points were basically mangled right here. A person identified as a National Security Council official said there was constant pressure from Obama, White House, and the Pentagon to produce figures to show the troop surge in 2009 and 11 was working, despite evidence to the contrary. Quote, it was impossible to create good metrics. We tried using troop numbers trained, violence levels, control of territory. None of it painted an accurate picture. None of it did. And this doesn't just go to Obama. This even goes all the way back to Rumsfeld, where these guys are looking for anything that they can use to try to show that this was going well. It decidedly was not. From the last point, and the issue that I think he's being dishonest about, is that the issue that a lot of people have on this is not that you're pulling out. It's that it is a cluster, you know what. That's the issue. It's that it seems to be on fire. It doesn't seem to be orderly. It doesn't seem to be what would have taken place considering we've invested nearly $3 trillion of the American purse into the country. And if you put it in real terms, think of like Medicare for all. You can get rid of homelessness for like $60 billion. If you're talking about sending all of these people to school, all of the things that could have been used, that money used for. And instead, it's basically flushed down the toilet. In fact, less than flushed down the toilet. Because what you would consider to be an enemy and a terrorist is now has a bunch of fighters with U.S. training, military bases, military equipment, a new Air Force, guns, bullets, munitions, special technology, and the works. This has been decidedly a failure. And that's the part of the speech that Joe Biden is flagrantly ignoring, and why he didn't take questions at the end of that and he just walked out. What are your thoughts, Shane?
I think, I mean, he kind of addressed the neocon angle, but the thing is, like we were talking about with Scott yesterday, whether we wanted, whether we were guilty of bloodlust or whether we wanted revenge on Bush's part, whatever the cause for going to war, it would have been better to have a leader who had handled it without starting one, because what we wanted wasn't really in Afghanistan. Technically, yes, Osama bin Laden was, being kept by the Taliban, but they were willing to give him up. They were willing to give him up. So we could have gotten him from them. We could have done the big crackdown thing where the problem is we'd have to critically look at Saudi Arabia and some other weird bedfellows that we have. But of course, that's always been the problem. My point being, we should, as it's only so helpful to repeat, we should never have been in Afghanistan. There was really no good reason to be there. Yeah. And I've tried to open-mindedly interrogate this from different angles. Okay, are there resources? Is there a State Department benefit?
It's why are we there?
To destabilizing it? I've looked at it from a couple of different angles here, trying to be charitable. And so far, none of them are bringing up any real, none of them are bringing any real reasons. In other words, we shouldn't have been there. I wanted to go to another clip though.
Go for it.
I was telling you about this.
Yeah.
This is also, you'll hear this. This is Matt Zeller, he's a veteran that MSNBC decided to interview. But you'll hear how this goes. Andre, let's play this clip.
Though I'm curious to hear your reaction of this consequential speech by the American president. Didn't run from it. He owned it. He owned his decision. He owned the fact that, as he put it, the buck stops with him.
I hope he gets to own their deaths too. I feel like I watched a different speech than the rest of you guys. I was appalled. There was such a profound, bold-faced lie in that speech. The idea that we planned for every contingency. I have been personally trying to tell this administration since it took office. I've been trying to tell our government for years that this was coming. We sent them plan after plan on how to evacuate these people. Nobody listened to us. They didn't plan for the evacuation of our Afghan wartime allies. They're trying to conduct it now at the 11th hour. The thing that they were most concerned about was the optics of a chaotic evacuation. Well, they got exactly what they were most concerned of by failing to do what was right when we could have done it. We had all the people and equipment in place to be able to save these people months ago, and we did nothing. I'm appalled that he thinks that we only need to take 2,000 people. There's 86,000 people who are currently left behind in Afghanistan alone. We've identified all of them for the government. I have no idea why he claims that people don't want to leave Afghanistan. I have a list of 14,000 names right now of people who want to get out of Afghanistan. And the idea that the Afghan military should be blamed for this, do you know how many casualties the Afghan military took in an average year?
That's exactly the point.
Perfect.
That's exactly the thing. You see why I want to play this clip.
Yeah,
and MSNBC, I want to come back to this because there's a media angle too. MSNBC deciding to have this guy on, keeping him on, especially after how they injured him, is just weird. But I'll come back to that. But on that last point, that's exactly the thing. We put guns in these dudes' hands.
Yes,
we paid them to fight for us. We took over their country. We installed a government. We said it would be better than their government. Then we're like, okay, you're starving. You're lacking money. We'll pay you to fight for us. Come be a mercenary for your new quote unquote government. Quote unquote your new quote unquote government. It's not really theirs, and it's a dysfunctional government at that. Anyway, we brought them in, and then we decided to leave. This was always our conceit. This was always our idea. We decided to bail, and then we blame them for not. Well, we're going to be.
Why didn't you stand and fight for us?
Why didn't you stand and fight for us?
Yeah.
Well, why didn't? And then I see on Twitter people responding to this video, which is making the rounds. Clearly, it's it's impactful.
The guy's right.
It's right, and people are sharing it and stuff. I see people responding to the tweet on this, like, well, should we have really fought for them if they didn't want to fight for themselves? You know what I mean? That kind of thing.
As if we were doing them a favor.
And
that's what I mean. That
kind of
argument
thing.
only
And if you're
works in
looking at
America.
it from the outside and you're like, well, you don't know anything literally except the most basic facts of the narrative or whatever. You can, I don't know, but if you think about it, no,
it's such a slap in the face.
That's not right at all. Yeah. We built these guys up. We deprive them. It's like pointing a gun at their head and then forcing them to fight for you. Okay, I'll pay. Okay, now that I've taken everything away from you, I'll pay you to fight for me. You're going to be my mercenary. I want you to keep everybody else from overthrowing this government that we have in place. Basically,
right?
Keep it in place. But at a certain point, I'm going to leave. I'm sorry. I need to leave. I've got stuff to do. I don't really have any interest in this place. But I still want you to keep my government in place. Keep me in power, okay? Keep me in power. Keep me in power. which is what we are asking them to do. I was pausing on that and being awkwardly like stuttery with that. We are asking them to keep us in power. That's all we're asking from them. If it's our government, that's all we actually, geopolitically, it's not just a bastion of free speech and democracy and women's rights and women not having to wear hijabs and drive cars, whatever. Yeah. It's our control.
It is our control. And I love the fact that he pointed out that it's like, look, you knew you were leaving. Why didn't you know this was going to happen? Because in the speech, Biden made the point of saying we plan for every convention, every convention and everything else and every outcome. But said we didn't expect it to fall this fast. And as the guy made the point, why didn't you? I mean, I could look at, it's always aggravating. It was just why I keep going back to the Afghanistan files, because they made the point of saying the place is going to collapse. They knew it was going to collapse years ago. I mean, they even went so far as to say the belief that these guys are going to be able to stand up to the Taliban is insane. There was no belief at all that that was going to take place within the context of the military and everything else. Yeah, the guy's right. It's like this notion that also the number of people that we're leaving behind, that's the other point. Like, how many people should we bring here? And if you have all of these people who were either interpreters or working with the U.S. government or basically collaborators, shouldn't those people be brought to the U.S. almost just...
We said we would. We said we would bring them here.
We brought our dogs first. No, seriously. They have the thing where they were getting the dogs and everything else lined up in order to get to leave the country. No, that guy's right, man. They knew, or at the very least, it was infinitely foreseeable that this was going to happen. And, you know, Biden's speech last time, I guess that gets to the thing, was Biden incompetent or was Biden just wrong? Or was it a little bit of both? And either way, yeah, this is a horrendous outcome. That guy is absolutely right to be apoplectic. The American public should be apoplectic. And I also think you're right, though, that from the standpoint of the American audience, they could listen to an argument and say, well, we did the best thing we could for him because we made the same argument for Iraq. So, yeah, it's unfortunate and it's aggravating to hear, but great clip.
Absolutely. Let's take it to a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, coming right back, talking about Haiti. Be back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime.
I like beer. Yeah, we drank beer.
Whoever's in charge, and I want to record it.
Let's talk about that.
Discussing all the controversies and news across the disunited states of America. Tune in to Fault Lines every weekday from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern, only on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. We are in the wake of a deadly earthquake that has taken place in Haiti. It was a 7.2 magnitude earthquake. So far, the death toll has soared to 1,297. That's as we know of. And if you remember, Haiti has had difficulties before, to put it mildly, with previous environmental damage from a previous earthquake that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. We're bringing on Jemima Pierre, Haiti America's coordinator for Black Alliance for Peace, to have a conversation about what is taking place right now in Haiti, what took place previously in regards to the earthquake, and whether or not there was any progress from then and now. And I also want to even get into the political situation and how that inhibits any kind of real progress and growth to basically avoid these type of eventualities in the future. Jemima Pierre, thank you for joining me. Am I pronouncing your name correctly first and foremost?
Yes, you are. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining me. It is very, very early there, and I appreciate you coming on for such short notice, so thank you.
Yes, no, my pleasure.
One very quick comment before I pass back to you, Jamarl, too. Jemima, our caller, friend of the show, Tarif, had recommended you for a couple of weeks now.
Oh, did she?
And so it's great to have you on. It's great to actually talk with you. I know that he was trying to set us up, and so I hope he's listening, and it's great to talk with you. Anyway, thank you, Jemima.
Excellent. I didn't know. Oh, very cool. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Haiti has an earthquake, 7.2 magnitude. Several years ago, there was another earthquake. Now, this is in my memory, I was alive during that time. And it killed hundreds of thousands of people, destroyed that particular territory. There were all sorts, I think, billions of dollars that were basically, supposedly, quote unquote, sent to the country. And yet, we still seem to have things like this take place where the infrastructure is ill-equipped to deal with the environmental emergencies that come about in the country. What happened between those two time frames, and why, and maybe let's just start at the beginning. Let's start here. What took place in regard to the earthquake, and why is it always so difficult for Haiti to, I guess you could say, maintain itself in the midst of these emergencies?
Right. So, well, I want to begin by saying that the crisis in Haiti is a crisis of imperialism and the crisis of continued foreign meddling in the country. So that's the first, because if we take the example of the earthquake on January 12, 2010, what we see were vultures circling Haiti. It was a combination of, a political situation that was completely made unstable and by the interventions of the U.S. government, Canada, France, and the UN. And then now we have the same situation. And let me explain that very clearly for you listeners, because Haiti is under occupation, and people don't want to realize this, because in 2004, the U.S., France, and Canada plotted to remove Aristide, the first democratically elected president, from Haiti. And, the U.S. Special Forces landed in his compound, and they put him on a plane, and they told him he needed to leave the country. After that, the UN was able to come in. They were able to they managed to get the Security Council to vote to have a deployment. And so for 17 years, there were thousands of foreign soldiers in Haiti. In the meantime, the U.S. really controlled every aspect of Haitian politics and and so on. The earthquake consolidated this coup, the earthquake in 2010. It consolidated this coup because what it did was it made us not stop talking about this occupation, foreign occupation. It had also allowed the U.S. to come in the fall of 2010 to install the PHTK, which is the Michel Martelly and then later Jovenel Moïse governments that were handpicked by the Obama administration and then later Trump, Martelly by Obama, Moïse by Trump, and held up even when there were mass protests against these people. And then in addition to that, you have $9 billion of aid, which is a lot of money, that was doled out after the 2010 earthquake, and that was quickly taken up by the NGOs, the international NGOs, the Haitian oligarchy, which is predominantly about 12 families and mostly non-Black 12 families.
Because they were building like soccer stadiums and these kind of experimental homes as opposed to actually using the money to rebuild Haiti, correct?
Yes, and so the perfect examples with the first thing I said when the earthquake happened on Saturday is don't give money to the American Red Cross, because one of the biggest scandals is the fact that the Red Cross raised $500 million for Haiti and built 6 houses. The ProPublica, did this story. And so we all know that, the Red Cross used most of the money for their own overhead, which was a lot of money for Haiti. And then you had, they had Bill Clinton in charge of the recovery effort. Mm-hmm. Who's the whole point around Bill Clinton was about raising money for his own foundation, and he was working in cahoots with the oligarchy, helping dole out no-bid contracts and so on. So these contracts didn't have to have any result. And so you have all the oligarchy, the international NGOs, those two groups, and as well as U.S. and Western imperialism, those 3 groups are the biggest beneficiaries of that aid money that came after the earthquake in 2010. So this time what we see are the vultures circling again, because the thing about the natural disasters is that it didn't have to be this way. You can have an earthquake where it doesn't kill 200,000 people.
Exactly, and that's kind of what I was getting at. It was more so like, just because there's a natural disaster doesn't necessarily mean that the death toll is going to be what it is, which means there has to be some of the reason that is making that worse. And that's kind of what I was trying to get to, like the political situation that was basically making the environmental situation that much more fraught. And there were huge protests earlier this year also. I mean, and this is what you mean when you're saying Moïse and some of the other ones that were basically installed by either Obama and Trump, and how it was creating all sorts of political currents in the country.
Yes, and so like Moise did not have a mandate from the very beginning. In fact, he had less of a mandate than Moise. Moise did not make the first round, for example, of the elections. That the U.S. force, months after the earthquake, but also a month after cholera outbreak, brought in by the UN soldiers. So Haiti has really gotten a lot of these disasters brought in from outside. And so Moise was brought in as Martelly's successor, handpicked by Martelly and bolstered by the U.S. government. And, right when he began, there were protests against him. In 2019 in particular, there were millions of people in the street protesting him because it was a report was released that, that whole political party stole $2 billion in Petrocaribe funds that was set up by the Venezuelan government using its oil revenues to help development in Haiti. And so the protests against him were nonstop. And then earlier in March, when he overstayed his mandate in February, he was supposed to step down February 7th. He said he wouldn't. And then the U.S. and UN basically upheld his decision, which is completely undemocratic. And so people were protesting, and no one, the international community did not say anything about democracy or Black Lives Matter because they wanted this puppet to stay in power. So by the time Moise gets assassinated on July 7th, he had no mandate, and the handpicked. He had two prime ministers vying for power upon his death. So that he had an interim prime minister, his sixth. Claude Joseph, and then one that he had appointed that was supposed to take power the day he died, Ariel Henry. And so those two vying prime ministers were, after he died, they were both claiming that they were in power. And so the U.S. sent a group of people down to basically tell them that Ariel Henry is their choice. And immediately it was announced by the UN, the U.S. Embassy, that Ariel Henry, who's the prime minister, would be the leader of Haiti, without any conversation with Haitian civil society, which had been meeting to come up with its own solution, which had put forward its own solution from earlier on the year, right, for a transition of power. So now what we have is a similar situation where there is no government to take care of the people during this earthquake, but also there was no infrastructure built in the 11 years since the other earthquake. Despite all the money that was doled out, despite the fact that there are all these international NGOs who say that they're there to help Haiti. Haiti has more NGOs than any other country in the world. They call it the Republic of NGOs. And so you wonder, why are all these people there if there's nothing, if it's that these natural events create disasters over and over again?
A very, very apropos question. A couple things to follow up on, just briefly, on the recent assassination of Moise. Just a top-level question that everybody would be asking. Do you know exactly, or what's your best guess as to who executed that, outside involvement, all those questions that were being asked and that have become somewhat muted in the month plus since he was assassinated? Jemima, what's your take on that?
Yes, I think, part of it, a lot of us are thinking that it was an inside job within his own party. I have to say nothing happens in Haiti without the knowledge of the U.S. State Department and the U.S. government. If they knew it, they must have known it and they let it happen. Or, you have to know, the other thing is, so it has to be carried out within the party, but by rich people, because who has this amount of money to carry out an assassination where you bring in 26 Colombian mercenaries, tell only 7 of them that this is going to be a murder. The others think that they're there to protect to serve as mercenaries for protection for the president. And so there's somebody that's, bankrolling all of this, and we don't know it yet. And my fear is that this earthquake is going to allow us to stop talking about the fact that this egregious act against the Haitian people happened, and that this high-level person or high-level group got away with this. And this is why people are afraid to talk, because it must be a high power, because the judges refuse to take the case, because every time a judge or clerk takes, work with them, they get killed. The last judge that took the case, his clerk was killed. And so people are thinking it's an outside, not outside, but it's an internal oligarchical group of people that were behind the assassination, and that the international community knew about it.
Wow. Jemima, let's take you to a break, and we're going to bring you back. The voice that you guys are listening to is Jemima Pierre. She's Haiti, America's coordinator for Black Alliance for Peace. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Breaking news, expert analysis, and exclusive stories, all in one place. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What do we want? News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune in to Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C., and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We are joined by Jemima Pierre. She's the Haiti Americas coordinator for the Black Alliance for Peace. Jemima, thank you again for sticking with us. I want to go back to 2004. What was the significance of the coup against Aristide? Can you please set up who Aristide was? Why, like you said, France, Canada, and the United States kicked him out effectively, deposed him. What happened there? Who was he? What was he pushing for? Why did we do that? Jemima.
Yes. There are a number of reasons. I think the first is Aristide was the first democratically elected president after a 29-year dictatorship of the Duvaliers, Baby Doc and Papa Doc, that was, supported by the U.S. government. And this was he was a priest from a poor parish in Haiti that really preached liberation theology, and no one had ever seen anyone get so much support from the Haitian poor. And he quickly beat out the handpicked candidate, the Western candidate, in 1990. During landslide elections where he won, during elections, the first elections where he won by a landslide, about 70% of the vote from the Haitian poor. The majority of the Haitian people are poor people. And so he was liberation theology priest. He was about, getting the rights of the dignity of the poor. He wanted to stop the exploitation, provide property and health care and so on for the Haitian people. And from the very beginning, they did not, the U.S. government and France and Canada did not want him. And in fact, it will be told, it's an open secret that the CIA was actually behind a first coup d'etat against them in 9 months after he got into power in 1991. He was forced into exile. And then he was in exile for about 3 years. And then to stem the tide of Haitian refugees, because they went after his party and killed thousands of people, Bill Clinton in 1994 reinstalled him with a force of 20,000 Marines that in 1994 that stayed in Haiti till 1999. But they told him that he could not complete his term, that he could only stay in power the last few months of his term, which meant that he only served 9 months at the beginning and then a few more months when he came back in 1994, because the Haitian presidency term is 5 years. So he gets down, and then in Haiti you cannot run for consecutive terms, and so he waits, and then he runs again and again wins by a landslide in 2000, for the elections, and this is when they're like So then there was a soft embargo imposed on the Aristide government, and they thought that he would not do the right kinds of neoliberal economic policies. They thought he was too radical, too much of a socialist figure for Haiti's poor. And so they, if you look up, your listeners should look up the Ottawa Initiative. So in the fall of 2003, Haiti, France, and Canada met in Ottawa to actually decide what to do about Aristide. And within a couple of months, on February 28, 29, the U.S. the U.S. Special Forces landed in Haiti and took Aristide out, put him on a plane, and flew him to the Central African Republic. So this is the first and last really democratically elected president. And after that, they decided they are not going to allow any other elections to chance. And that's what they've been able to actually install leader after leader instead of leaving the elections to the will of the poor people.
That is so unfortunate. I mean, and, it's not like this is not without precedent. I mean, Guatemala, the Congo, Dominican Republic, South Vietnam, Brazil, Chile, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Haiti is one of those countries. Yeah, of the list of countries that the United States has toppled and knocked over. And unfortunately, after the toppling, we often forget the fact that we knocked the country over and pretend as if all of the problems associated with the country are specific only to the country. I mean, we do this in South America all the time when, these guys go to the border and act as if, yeah. The problem with those countries is that they're just basket cases and environmental damage. It has nothing to do with the coups and knocking those countries over or installing certain policies in the countries itself. From your standpoint, what needs to happen in Haiti going forward from here? I know a lot of people saying, hands off Haiti, do not send peacekeepers, do not send these other troops and everything else. So from your point of view, what needs to happen? And secondary to that question, to piggyback on it, what most likely will occur?
Yeah, what needs to happen is Haitian people need to be left alone to determine their own destiny. There's a whole group of 40 organizations that have been trying to have their own solution of civil society, the clergy getting together since January, coming up with different solutions. They've been completely bypassed by the international community. So Haiti needs to be left alone. We need the end of the imperial meddling. We need the core group, which is a self-assigned group of representatives from the UN, the EU, the OAS, Spain, Portugal, that actually make all the decisions in Haiti. We need these people to leave Haiti, and we need the UN to disintegrate, to dismantle its office in Haiti because they have so much say. So that's the first thing. The political situation needs to be turned back to Haitians, and there needs to be that end of foreign meddling, because if we have that. If people get out of Haiti, Haitians know how to take care of themselves. And I have to tell you, I was in Haiti 5 days after the earthquake in 2010. And what you saw, what was not reported, was this Haitians taking care of themselves and taking care of each other. People were sleeping in the streets, but they were feeding each other. They were housing each other. They were giving one another clothes, and there was no violence, right? And so people can take care of themselves. It's just, it's a disaster. It opens them up for disaster capitalism because the imperial meddling has been so nonstop in Haiti. And so this is what should happen, that they leave Haiti alone politically. What is going to happen is that you're going to have the U.S. military show up, because that's exactly what Samantha Powers, who's been put in charge of Haiti aid relief, that's exactly what she said. The first thing she did was meet with the Department of Defense and Southcom to figure out an aid package or aid relief for Haiti. And I have to tell you quickly, right after the 2010 earthquake, the first thing Obama did was deploy the Southern Command deployed a military force of 22,000 soldiers in Haiti, in addition to all the foreigners there, and then surrounded the country by Navy and Coast Guard ships and activated Operation Vigilant Sentry to stop Haitians from trying to get on boats to get to the U.S. And that's the first thing that the U.S. government did. They took over Haitian airspace to prevent anybody else from coming into Haiti. So that was their first thought after the 2010 earthquake. And I have a feeling that that's exactly what's going to happen now with Haiti, especially since you already have the U.S. military involved. And then I think the NGOs are going to go back again and try to take over. The only good thing this time is that a lot of people are saying these large Western NGOs are telling everyone not to give money to these large Western NGOs and to instead give money to local organizations on the ground. And I'm hoping that this will change the tide at least a little bit in terms of the disaster, in terms of relief for people after these natural events.
Creating some internally sort of sustainable means for support, that kind of thing. Two quick questions here. We only have enough time probably for one of them, but I'll let you figure that out. All right. Two quick things here, though. One, the ongoing protests in Haiti, which, like you said, didn't get nearly as much coverage as they were due, as they were happening earlier this year, and before that, of course. Do you see signs of those creating like more internal political strength? I don't know how else to put that could stand up to some of this international, constant international intervention. And then on the point of international intervention, you brought up Bill Clinton earlier. The Clinton Foundation's involvement in Haiti is one of the more notorious aspects of specifically in the United States, how people know about Haiti, thinking about them politically, the Clintons being there. Can you just go into a little bit more? What did they do? What was the relationship like? You mentioned dealing with the local oligarchs, no bid contracts, that kind of thing. Were they there to sort of cement our control by working with local oligarchs? I don't want to lead the question, but what was their role there, Jemima?
Yes. Well, let me start with what's going to happen in terms of the political situation is that I think it's going to consolidate this illegitimate government that the foreign powers have put in place, because we're going to be focused on, aiding Haitians hurt by the earthquake, and it's going to silence the conversations around the fact that this government is illegitimate. And already he's saying that elections will have to be postponed because of the earthquake, even though after the first earthquake, the U.S. government was pushing for elections. And so that remains to be seen. And so I do think they're going to be consolidated. It's going to be a lot harder to push them out. Now, Bill Clinton is what I call a classic abuser of Haiti. From when he was president, his policies towards Haiti decimated the Haitian rice industry because he wanted to help his Arkansas farmers. And he later apologized, mea culpa, was my fault. And, so that's a classic abuser. You abuse the person and then you cry about it and apologize, but you keep abusing them. After the earthquake, Obama put Clinton and George W. Bush to lead the fundraising effort in Haiti through the Clinton-Bush Haiti Fund. All at once, Clinton was the co-chair of the Interim Commission for Reconstruction of Haiti. So all the money went through Bill Clinton, right? He was also the UN Special Envoy for Haiti and the co-director of the Bush-Clinton Haiti Fund. So in other words, he was there to prime Haiti for disaster capitalism. And because it was through him that there are these partnerships with the oligarchy, using aid money to build hotels and so on, And so Bill Clinton should stay away from Haiti because there's no more dubious character when it comes to Haiti than Bill Clinton, and it just tells you that if all these foreigners would stay out of Haiti, we would be just fine. But they're all using Haiti as, the staging ground for their own wealth, for their own political machinations, for everything else. Meanwhile, the local Haitian people are really struggling.
Jemima, we have about 30 seconds. Just real quick, how much money would you estimate over the course of, let's say, from 2010 to now, has been donated to Haiti versus how much do you believe has been allocated, let's say, in a more honest way that's actually went towards Haitians?
Well, the numbers came out. It was $9 billion in aid to Haiti. In fact, The Guardian reported in 2013, I believe, that about 94% of the humanitarian funding went to donors-owned civilian and military entities, UN agencies, international NGOs, and private contractors. And so, they say for every dollar of aid that's given to Haiti, only about 1 cent of them actually gets down to.
That is so unfortunate. Jemima, thank you for coming on. And again, thank you. It's such short notice. Thank you. This is a great conversation. The voice that you guys were listening to is Jemima Pierre. She's Haiti America's coordinator for Black Alliance for Peace. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Shane and I'll be back in a moment.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I am your ever-vigilant, your indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And that would strongly insist you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Great conversation with Jamima Pierre. As Shane made the point, he said she's our Haiti person from here on out. It was a really good conversation. I really appreciated that.
Yes.
And like I made the point to Shane, she's in like Los Angeles. So it's like 3 a.m. or something there, some insane time, or 4:30 in the morning, I think, when we first contacted her. So thank you very much. Let's get to the headlines. In the news, about 252,369 new COVID cases were reported in the United States yesterday, and there were about 1,016 new deaths. We're back over the 1,000 mark. Great. Over the past week, there's been an average of 141,365 cases per day, an increase of 64% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 51% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and 60% of residents have received at least 1 dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected about 36,980,215 people across the United States and has put into the ground 622,244 men, women, and children in this country. U.S. experts are expected to recommend COVID-19 vaccine boosters for Americans for age 8. U.S. experts are expected to recommend COVID-19 vaccine boosters for Americans of all ages 8 months after they receive their second dose. Boosters will only be administered after the FDA formally approves the vaccine. New Zealand has declared a nationwide lockdown after detecting its first COVID cases in 6 months. There's also a pretty major outbreak in regards to Florida in one of the schools there, where a lot of the kids have gotten or being quarantined. Yesterday, major U.S. oil companies sued Biden administration for halting drilling auctions on federal land and waters this year. They state that the government is required by law to hold regular sales. During this campaign, Biden promised to stop issuing new leases to oil and gas companies as part of his agenda to combat climate change. His administration paused drilling actions or auctions in January pending review of the program's environmental impacts and value to taxpayers. Bob Dylan is facing allegations of sexual abuse dating back 50 years to 1965, when a woman now accuses Dylan of plying her with drinks and drugs at the age of 12 and molesting her for 6 weeks. Biden's speech on Afghanistan will respond with, quote, devastating force, unquote, to any attacks on Americans, criticized the Afghan army for losing its will to fight. 2 days after taking Kabul, the Taliban has urged government officials in the city to return to work. The international airport in Kabul, reportedly, no music and women are scarce. Federal authorities are investigating Tesla for at least 11 accidents involving autopilot or other self-driving features, specifically accidents featuring emergency vehicles such as fire engines and ambulances. The 11 accidents led to 17 injuries and 1 death. In Earth and Science news, the first ever U.S. water shortage was declared yesterday on a reservoir supplying Arizona and Nevada. The states, which are both affected by drought, will begin to cut water use from the new year. Officials are blaming the problem on climate change. NASA's Perseverance Mars rover first rock sample has gone missing. The metallic tube expected to hold the sample was examined and found empty. NASA believes that the rock's targeting did not react correctly, but of course, this could also just be another case for some possessive Martians. Could be that. The man who popularized the game Sudoku has died at the age of 69 after seeing the game in a magazine under the name Number, Place, Maki Kaji renamed it Sudoku and released it in a Japanese magazine in 1984, long before seeing the rise of the game to international popularity and success about 20 years ago. Those are your headlines. You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I want to load one of the clips from earlier that we played first thing this morning of Biden's speech. And it could be the very first one, not the first one of the general, but the first one of Biden. And that would go into Biden explains his choice. Because this seems to be the story of the day, that Joe Biden basically had to come back and explain what was taking place in Afghanistan. We played the speech yesterday of Biden making the point of saying, we're not going to see Afghanistan look like Vietnam. We're not going to see it, people hanging off of helicopters. Yeah, we're not going to see those things. And yet, those are indeed the things that we saw. And so let's play this. We played the first part this morning. We talked about it for the monologue. Shane and I did a back and forth on it.
And we have the clip from yesterday, too.
Oh, excellent. Let's play that clip then so you guys can hear exactly what I'm saying as opposed to what you're saying.
Yeah. We were just talking about that. Just want to make sure he has time to pull it up. But we've got it. This is Biden early July, I believe, over a month ago, describing the pullout from Afghanistan, all this stuff. Andre, let's play this clip.
Is the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan now inevitable?
No, it is not. Because you have the Afghan troops have 300,000 well-equipped as any army in the world, and an air force against something like 75,000 Taliban. It is not inevitable.
Mr. President, thank you very much. Your own intelligence community has assessed that the Afghan government will likely collapse.
That is not true.
Can you please clarify what they have told you about whether that will happen or not?
That is not true. They did not reach that conclusion.
What is the level of confidence that they have that it will not collapse?
The Afghan government and leadership has to come together. They clearly have the capacity to sustain the government in place.
And do you see any parallels between this withdrawal and what happened in Vietnam with some people feeling...
None whatsoever. Zero. What you had entire brigades breaking through the gates of our embassy. 6, if I'm not mistaken. The Taliban is not the North Vietnamese army. They're not remotely comparable in terms of capability. There's going to be no circumstance where you see people being lifted off the roof of a embassy of the United States from Afghanistan. It is not at all comparable.
Let's stop there.
So
Let's
the
stop there
question
for a
now
moment, because I think that's enough to get across how fantabulously wrong that was. And, you know, we were talking about this yesterday on some level. I mean, there's a question of whether Biden is lying here or Biden is incompetent. And it may be a little bit of both. And the reason why I say that, if I can look at the Afghan files, and I know that Biden was the vice president, and that he was in the room to those meetings where they could not get good numbers, that it was very clear that we were losing, that these guys were paper tigers or this stuff was just on paper alone, then he should know better than to come out and give proclamations like this. And for it to just basically unravel over the course of a weekend is utterly astonishing to me. We have one more clip of Biden that I want to get to. And he goes into this notion saying basically he's trying to explain his choice. This will be the second clip that we played earlier this morning, so I give a little bit of time to get it up. But basically, Biden has to look into the American public and explain to them, how did I get this so wrong? And again, it's not the issue that we're leaving. It's more so that it's being done in the middle of a fire. Let's play the clip.
The choice I had to make as your president was either to follow through on that agreement or be prepared to go back to fighting the Taliban in the middle of the spring fighting season. There would have been no ceasefire after May 1. There was no agreement protecting our forces after May 1. There was no status quo of stability without American casualties after May 1. There was only the cold reality of either following through on the agreement to withdraw our forces or escalating the conflict and sending thousands more American troops back into combat in Afghanistan lurching into the third decade of conflict. I stand squarely behind my decision. After 20 years, I've learned the hard way that there was never a good time to withdraw U.S. forces. That's why we're still there. We were clear-eyed about the risks. We planned for every contingency, but I always promised the American people that I will be straight with you. The truth is, this did unfold more quickly than we had anticipated. So what's happened? Afghanistan political leaders gave up and fled the country. The Afghan military collapsed, sometime without trying to fight. If anything, the developments of the past week reinforced that ending U.S. military involvement in Afghanistan now was the right decision. American troops cannot and should not be fighting in a war and dying in a war that Afghan forces are not willing to fight for themselves.
I'm always amazed by that. I want to go to Shane's clip after this one, because he makes this point about saying, you know, we planned for every contingency. Clearly you didn't. Clearly you didn't. You shouldn't even say that. Why would you even say that under this model? I mean, you have people who are basically flooding the airports. You have people who are, apparently they found remains in one of the planes in a situation that you said was not going to take place. And you have hundreds of thousands of people there who probably do want to leave, that Biden argued, oh, they didn't want to leave.
My only thing about this clip, Jamarl, is that I was thinking of playing it with John.
Oh, okay.
Which would be like in 5 minutes.
Yeah. So let's push.
And so I didn't want to do it right back.
No worries. But it's just farcical, this idea that we plan for every contingent. How could you plan for every contingent and not be aware that the place was going to fall in 2 days? I mean, it's utterly astonishing.
Yes.
And it's like, they wouldn't fight for themselves. It's not that they were fighting for themselves, dude. They were fighting for you. They were fighting for this government. There's a difference in those things. We made a monstrously corrupt government. We put all of this training into all of these people. And fact of the matter is, why would they fight for a puppet government? That's the part that doesn't entirely make sense. And yet, that's the part that Joe Biden is basically trying to make this argument that they didn't fight for us, so we need to leave. We tried to do them a favor. We tried to help them out, but the buck stops with me, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We planned for everything. I don't think he did. What do you think, Shane? not to mention the money that was spent. Like, what could we have done with that money? That's the other part. What could we have done with all of that money, nearly $3 trillion?
Oh, and that's I don't think we played this clip just now. This would have been, I think, the third of the ones that you played earlier from the speech yesterday of Biden's, where he's talking about, you know, there are other priorities around the world that need our attention. Like, which is totally true. And you're getting at the home spending, the home nation building. You can look at any random bridge that's fallen apart in the United States and think, hey, there's a nation to build here. But that's not what he's talking about, right? He's probably talking about China.
He's talking about other countries.
Yeah, about other countries, that we're going to go up against or have to deal with, that kind of thing. China, Russia, this nebulous they that he doesn't have to refer to. But of course, I don't know, that's the thing the Pentagon is for and the State Department is for. Of course, is foreign policy. This is State Department speak, right?
Yeah.
When he's reading the teleprompter there, somewhat well, I'll give it to him. It's not like he fell asleep at any point during the speech. When he's reading the teleprompter there, he's reading State Department speak, which is like bureaucrats trying to cover their butts and wearing humanitarian causes like socialites wear jewelry or something like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And he's putting that language on. He's using that language. That's what we're hearing here. It doesn't. But you're right. There are no contingencies, and it doesn't make sense. And if you look at what he's saying and look at what actually happened, you'll see that what he's saying is a lie, and it's trying to convince you of something that isn't true. And here's the thing I want to come back to. I don't know that I want to get into this in the conversation with John so much. Hey, we could, but it's a little bit weird watching the media on this because for the first time, I'm seeing left and right media outlets more willing to attack Biden on something. Hey, they're hitting him on something. People are willing to smack him on it. Now, what is it? Well, because we're leaving a war. We're ending a war, which is a little bit dissatisfying. But in the clip that they're going to play, we'll probably play in a couple of minutes, a guy on MSNBC, and most of the clip is just the guy they're interviewing talking, not the MSNBC person. But they chose to have this person on, knowing roughly what he'd think, probably, and they chose to keep him on. And he talks for like a minute and a half, almost 2 minutes straight. My point is, they were open to that angle, which is a harshly anti-Biden angle. And if this is what they're willing to permit criticism of Biden on, even though I agree in some sense with him that we should have withdrawn, it's just not in this way, of course. Right. It's just a weird. I think you see what I'm saying.
MSNBC
what does this
is allowing an opening to hit Biden.
And is this going to turn? Is this foreign policy? Is this media? I'm asking a question, but it's rhetorical. I know it will. If Biden does more things like ending wars or pulling back from or calming things down with Russia and China, more of the anti-Biden flack will come. I can assure you, in the same way that it followed what Trump did. Whenever he talked about bombing somebody or entering a war, the criticism got muted for a minute.
Yeah.
And whenever he talked about pulling out, suddenly it would ramp up again. And that's what we see here with Biden.
What did Brian Williams say when Donald Trump sent those missiles over? And he was like, the light, he started quoting poetry, the light of the sky blaze or something like that, some nonsense.
It was like the first time they'd agreed with Trump was when he bombed Syria, right?
If I'm not mistaken, they said this is the first time the president seems presidential.
Exactly.
Killing other people.
Isn't that disgusting?
It is disgusting.
My point is, we've been talking, when is the media going to hit, forget Fox, when is anybody other than Fox on mainstream TV going to be willing to hit Biden on pretty much anything? And it turns out it's when we leave a war.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. If it wasn't set on fire, do you think they would have hit him differently? Like, meaning, let's say he didn't leave like this. Let's say it was an orderly, like the clip from the gentleman basically saying, they knew about this for like a year.
Yeah.
It's like the notion that you accidentally fall into this is appalling.
He would have been a lot. He wouldn't have gotten nearly as much. But here's the thing: even if it had been an orderly withdrawal, say we get out, we're there until September 11th, and then we're magically, we have troops on the ground, and then they're all gone. Right. They just like everything is out at September 11th, and then we've kept the Taliban at bay, and then after September 11th, slowly they take over Afghanistan within a couple of months. That's the most optimistic scenario from the U.S.'s perspective. Right. At that point, and even before then, he'll start getting hit, but a lot less than he is now. That's my alternate universe guess.
Yeah, I think it's the same, because I think it's kind of like Obama in Libya, and we need to go. But if you remember when Obama, when they attacked Libya and they basically, destroyed the country, and they were out there selling slaves, they didn't cover that. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah,
they covered the bombings.
Yes.
And they covered, it was like the Wonder Twins, Tony Blair and not Tony Blair, I'm sorry, the UK, France, and Obama coming together in order to drop bombs unilaterally on this country. Now, what they showed that part. And they showed Gaddafi, they showed that part. But they didn't show the country descending into a basket case and into a civil war, and to them selling black slaves, where you had the indignity of the first black president presiding over a situation where they started selling slaves in the country. They didn't show that part. And the only reason I knew about it was because of Republican Michael Steele. Michael Steele was on MSNBC one day. Something came up about foreign policy or Libya or something like that. And Michael Steele was like, I don't know if you've seen Libya lately, but that's not a success story. And then they went off there, and I'm like, what do you mean? What is he talking about? And it's like, if you're looking it up, you're like, oh my God. They just ignored this as if this wasn't a basket case and if this was somehow a success. And so it's like in dealing with Biden, would they do him something in a similar fashion? No, I think they would probably hit Biden for that, because the difference is Obama might have turned that place into a basket case, but we decided to actually leave Afghanistan. And there's a difference in those two things. Meaning you can have the basket case, leaving, not so much. And that's, like you say, is sick. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going to be back in a moment with the one and only John Kiriakou talking about the CIA. Back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones, with the historical context to tie them together? Well, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are joined talking about Afghanistan and the rise of the Taliban there, the absolute loss and chaotic, still ongoing departure of the United States. We're joined by John Kiriakou. For those listening, John Kiriakou is a former CIA officer, co-host of The Backstory on Radio Sputnik, and author of books including The CIA Insider's Guide to the Iran Crisis and The Reluctant Spy. Follow John on Twitter at John Kiriakou and learn more about him. Check him out at johnkiriakou.com. John, thanks for joining us. Are you still out on the Aegean Sea, John?
No, I'm back. I was in the studio yesterday for the first day. Back in Washington.
Oh, you bastard! I was going to live vicariously through you for just a second longer. No, I'm just kidding. It's great. It's great to have you. I know you'd come back. It's really great to have you. Good to talk, John. A lot has happened since we last talked with you. We have lost, I would say, the war in Afghanistan. But I'll just hand it over to you. How would you frame the events of the last, say, week, John?
Yeah, in Afghanistan specifically, this is not just a loss, which we all expected. But it's a major intelligence failure. I mentioned yesterday on my own show that just a week ago, President Biden said that he expected the Afghan government to be able to hold on to Kabul for about 6 months. Now, the reason he said that is because that's what he was briefed. That was in the president's daily brief provided to him by the CIA every day. So CIA analysis was that the Afghan government was going to hold on for 6 months. It held on for 6 days. This is a major intelligence failure to the point where it endangered American lives as part of the evacuation process. And I can't help but to think that somebody has to resign for this, whether it's the CIA director or the Secretary of State or the National Security Advisor. There has to be some sort of accountability for this major failure.
Calling it a failure is an understatement, John. How did they get this so wrong? Maybe that's the way to ask this question. Because, again, going back to the Afghanistan files by the Washington Post, it was very clear that they didn't have this full belief that these guys would be able to stand up right here. It says, in lessons learned interviews, military trainers describe Afghan security forces as incompetent, unmotivated, and rife with deserters. They accuse Afghan commanders of pocketing salaries paid by taxpayers for tens of thousands of quote-unquote ghost soldiers. And right here, none of them expressed confidence that the Afghan army and police could ever fend off, much less defeat the Taliban on their own. More than 60,000 members of Afghan security forces have been killed as a casualty rate that the U.S. called unsustainable. So it wasn't like they were, unclear that the people weren't prepared or, that these things were just numbers on paper and not necessarily the reality of events. So, I mean, Biden should have known this. Going beyond the CIA person, right? I mean, I guess that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah, he did know it. It's been clear to everybody involved with Afghanistan since the aughts, right? More than a decade ago, that the Afghan military and the Afghan National Police were not viable entities. I went to Afghanistan several times that decade, starting in 2002. I went in 2007, 2009, 2011. And let me just give you two short anecdotes to try to encapsulate how everybody knew but refused to admit that this was just disastrous. First, we outsourced to DynCorp, the big defense contractor, the training of the Afghan National Police. And what they tried to do was to bring Afghan nationals from all over the country, regardless of tribe, regardless of background or region, bring them all together to make them Afghans first and tribalists second. That was silly. That's never going to work. And what ended up happening was that one of the Pashtun police recruits, who apparently was loyal to the Taliban, poisoned a pot of stew that was being served at dinner. He killed a dozen of his trainees. And then that night, he let 3 other members of the Taliban into the dormitory where the survivors were sleeping, and they stabbed them all to death. That's what the Afghan government, that's what the U.S. military was up against. Now, in 2011, I went to Afghanistan with John Kerry, who at the time was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And as soon as we arrived, we got this high-level VIP briefing. It was a dozen generals from 1 to 4 stars, all sitting around the table, and Carrie and a colleague and me. And they go through this classified briefing with all these slides. We're winning here, we're winning there, things are better here, things are better there, we're taking over these cities. And then we got out of the briefing, and Carrie said to me, my God, it looks like we may actually win this thing. And I said, Senator, we're not going to win this thing. They've been giving this same briefing since 2002. This is all wishful thinking. None of this stuff is true. But this is the same thing that they were briefing to every congressional delegation that went through Afghanistan. It was all a lie. And the Washington Post has documented that. So you're right. There was no surprise that the government fell as quickly as it did. It never had a chance in the first place.
So they've been consistently wrong about this for like decades at this point, and they're still wrong about it now. What would have to go wrong inside the internal machinery of the State Department, the CIA, the Afghan watchers who have been trying to understand the situation for decades now? Like, what in the machinery, something have to be a lot of spanners thrown into the works, so to speak. Like,
You're exactly right.
What's
Shane.
going on, John?
You're exactly right. What it is we try to impose a U.S. mindset on these other countries. Okay, we never, after all these years, after 20 years, we never understood Afghan culture. We never understood the Afghan mindset. We refused to accept the fact that we could not impose democracy on a country that has never had democracy in its 3,000-year history. You know, they've got this Loya Jirga, this consultative council, but Western-style democracy, it's not up to us to impose on these people. They don't understand it. They don't like it, and it's foreign to them. The next thing is corruption. I mean, this has to be the most corrupt country in the world. I mentioned yesterday on the show that I do with your dad, the backstory, that the last time I left Afghanistan, I was leaving from Bagram Air Base, and what you do when you take off, it's almost like a rocket where you have to take off almost straight up in this corkscrew fashion, and it's so that it makes it hard for a surface-to-air missile to hit your plane. It's really rough on the stomach, too. But anyway, when you're taking off in this corkscrew, you get this view outside of Bagram Air Base of these magnificent mansions. And I said to one of the guys on the plane, look at these mansions. These are like Beverly Hills-style mansions. Who do these belong to? And he said, oh, those belong to the poppy exporters, the guys that export the heroin poppy. Except for that one. That belongs to the prime minister. And that one over there is the minister of justice. And that one over there is the head of the Afghan intelligence service. Well, it turned out that none of those belong to drug pushers. They all belong to corrupt Afghan government officials. They've been stealing our money since the September 11th attacks, or the immediate aftermath of the September 11th attacks. So corruption was another thing. And the third thing was just this unwillingness on the part of the grunt soldiers and policemen to defend their country. They were just never interested in defending their country, perhaps because the Taliban are not foreign interlopers. They are brothers and cousins and tribal members, and they just didn't have the fight in them.
And like you said, the three reasons you gave: the impossibility of the cause, corruption, the intense corruption of the cause, and the unwillingness of the people that were ostensibly trying to organize into a nation. The first two would very much lead to the third. In other words, if they're looking at us, these are outside forces trying to do something to us that's never going to happen. I don't get it. I don't want it. Why are you doing this? And if they see the government that we've installed is incredibly corrupt, well, they're going to be pretty unwilling to defend it, right? They're going to be unwilling to back it. Jamarl, I saw you trying to comment.
Oh, no, I was just agreeing with you. I mean, if you're looking at the money, I mean, $3 million a day for projects in a place that basically were mud huts. And it's like, how do you spend that money? And it said the gusher of aid from Washington gave rise to historic levels of corruption. And it wasn't like the public was unaware of it. And in fact, I mean, you had situations where people would even go to Taliban courts because they believed the government was so radically corrupt.
Mm-hmm. So that's exactly right. You know, I flew to Kandahar one time. Kandahar is the second largest city in Afghanistan, and it was sort of the birthplace of the Taliban. And early on, back in 2002, we decided to spend billions and billions of dollars to build an electrical grid down there. So we go down there and we look at the electrical grid, and this is all great and fine, and it's going to help in the development of the country. The next time I went to Afghanistan, I asked, how's that electrical grid going? Oh, the Taliban blew it up. I said, oh, so there's no electricity in the villages down there? Nope, no electricity. We're going to rebuild it. Then when I finally went in 2007, how's that electrical grid going? Oh, the Taliban blew it up again. We're going to give it another try. Well, this was happening all over the country. It was like a bottomless pit for American taxpayers' money. And we spent 3.2, I think it is, trillion dollars. And now we have literally nothing to show for it.
Well, I always like to say less than nothing, because I suspect
it is. It's less than nothing because we lost lives.
And give me your take on this. Well, yes, lost lives, but also training. I mean, hundreds of thousands of Afghans that were trained, weapons, Air Force, military bases, fitness gyms. That Shane just showed me the thing with the Taliban were working on the fitness gyms.
In the presidential palace.
Presidential palace. There were bumper carts. Meaning the stuff that was there is now theirs, whether it's weapons, machinery, technology, and training. Because it seems that the Taliban is trying, this is like Taliban 2.0, that they were going to try to have some kind of national state of something, whatever that looks like in their image. And it's very possible that all of the training that went into the troops for the Afghan government will now be going to their ends. Meaning, I don't think that's just going to get wasted. It's probably going to be used in the service of the state. Tell me something. How does the CIA mechanically work in these countries where it would get intelligence one way or the other? Meaning, let's say, like you said, Biden was given a briefing. And in Biden's head, based on the briefing, he thought it would last, I don't know, let's say at least 2 weeks. At least 2 weeks.
Right.
That it wouldn't fall over the weekend. And like you said, he was briefed in that. Biden didn't go and take a look himself. So what are the mechanics of getting this information from the standpoint of the CIA? How do they get the information? How do they present it? What does it look like on the ground from the standpoint of the CIA officer as that information is transported to the president?
Well, Afghanistan is unique in that there was very, very little human intelligence. They didn't need human intelligence because we ran the country. So if you had a question, wanted to know what the president's, what the president of Afghanistan's intentions were, you just walked up to him and asked him. So this was not human intelligence. It was almost exclusively electronic intelligence. Electronic intelligence and intelligence that the military was gathering. And they do it in a whole bunch of different ways. So all this information is transmitted back to the intelligence community, including CIA, DIA, State Department, Bureau of Intelligence and Research, and all the other smaller organizations. And the analysts read all of it. They take in this. It's called all-source intelligence, and they assign somebody every day, it's usually somebody different, to write up the latest update. And then once the update is written, it's emailed to all of the other Afghan military analysts in the intelligence community. Everybody chops on it. Do I agree? Do I disagree? Do I like this word or this sentence? Finally, they come up with a finished piece. And it goes into the president's briefing book, and the president reads it the next morning at 7 o'clock. So what you're seeing in this president's daily brief, the PDB, is groupthink, right? Usually if somebody objects, they end up coming into line with the change of a word or a sentence. In very rare cases, they'll write something called a dissent. So the first few paragraphs of the president's book, it'll say X, Y, and Z is happening in Afghanistan. And at the bottom of the page, there would be a paragraph that says DIA dissents or the state INR dissents. This is what we think is happening. But that's extremely rare. In all the years I was in the CIA, I think I saw a dissent 3 or 4 times. Extremely rare. So what the president ends up getting is this watered down groupthink where everybody finally agrees on the least common denominator.
That sounds incredibly ineffective, but you also set this up by saying that we didn't have the humans. We didn't have human resources on the ground. We had a government after all, so we could just refer to them directly. But they can lie to us, can't they? And maybe they would have,
they did.
They would have more of an incentive to than our own intelligence officers. And that's where I was going to go. They would. So how critical, how pivotal do you think that is? And also great question, Jamarl, on the sort of mechanism of this stuff. But how pivotal do you think their lying was to our failure to predict this, to respond to it, to plan for it, John?
I think it was critical, Shane, because from the very beginning, they knew that that was exactly what the generals wanted to hear. Everything's going well. But if you look at a map of Afghanistan, as recently as, 3 or 4 weeks ago, you would see, or even as far back as the mid-2000s, you would see that the president of Afghanistan was essentially really just the mayor of Kabul. And there were little pockets of areas, especially in western and northern Afghanistan, where it was safe for an Afghan government official to go. But the rest of the country was always controlled by the Taliban. Always. They never gave up control.
And the span of available space, it just shrinks. It gets smaller and smaller over time. You know this stuff clearly much better than I do, but you were talking about being in Kandahar, and we were talking about Kabul clearly. I remember late last week, we were talking about the city that was taken, I believe it was Ghazni, between Kabul and Kandahar. A big, and I was like, wait, if they've taken that, they're besieging Kandahar. It's basically just the capital left. They've cut it off all the major arteries they have here.
Yes.
It's when they want to. And then it was like, I saw articles in the Washington Post, I think as late as Thursday, Friday, saying, will Afghanistan fall to the Taliban within a month? That kind of thing. And I was like, I kind of went along with that. I kind of bought the line. I was like, they'll wait for us to leave, right? They'll wait. The Taliban will wait for us to leave because they don't want to risk incurring our wrath. Well, clearly I was wrong. Clearly no. Clearly everybody was wrong on this one. No, they had no reason to wait. I want to go to a clip, John. I want to hear your thoughts on it. This is Matt Zeller, and interestingly enough, this was on MSNBC. Andre, let's play this clip real quick. Thanks.
So I'm curious to hear your reaction of this consequential speech by the American president. Didn't run from it. He owned it. He owned his decision. He owned the fact that, as he put it, the buck stops with him.
I hope he gets to own their deaths too. I feel like I watched a different speech than the rest of you guys. I was appalled. There was such a profound, bold-faced lie in that speech. The idea that we planned for every contingency. I have been personally trying to tell this administration since it took office. I've been trying to tell our government for years that this was coming. We sent them plan after plan on how to evacuate these people. Nobody listened to us. They didn't plan for the evacuation of our Afghan wartime allies. They're trying to conduct it now at the 11th hour. The thing that they were most concerned about was the optics of a chaotic evacuation. Well, they got exactly what they were most concerned of by failing to do what was right when we could have done it. We had all the people and equipment in place to be able to save these people months ago, and we did nothing. I'm appalled that he thinks that we only need to take 2,000 people. There's 86,000 people who are currently left behind in Afghanistan alone. We've identified all of them for the government. I have no idea why he claims that people don't want to leave Afghanistan. I have a list of 14,000 names right now of people who want to get out of Afghanistan. And the idea that the Afghan military should be blamed for this, do you know how many casualties the Afghan military took in an average year?
And that is Matt Zeller.
Wow.
Yeah, that was by Brian Williams on MSNBC interviewing Matt Zeller, veteran. Just a crazy clip. Of course, he's referencing Biden's speech. Jamarl and I were talking about that earlier this morning. I wanted to turn to that for a minute. And one specific angle, I'm curious to hear your thoughts generally, but you're talking about groupthink earlier with the writing of these reports, the briefings that the president will read. If you listen to Biden and you buy what he says, which I don't think anybody does on a deep level, on a kind of subliminal level. But if you buy what he says, you're gonna stay in that kind of groupthink. Like I was referring to it as State Department speak or state speak or something. The way that he's not really saying all that much. What could the CIA learn? What should the CIA learn? Just looking at the CIA for a minute, you could look at the State Department too. What should they learn? What lies should they sort of start to dispel in what Biden was saying in that speech? From this whole morass, this whole problem, John.
Yeah. I'm not sure that it's so much a lesson for the CIA operationally as it is for the military. For the CIA analytically, man, this is another failure in a very long line of failures. The CIA neglected to predict 9/11. They neglected to predict the fall of the Soviet Union and the Berlin Wall, the Indian nuclear test, you name it. Going back to 1947, it's analytic failure after analytic failure. And this is another one of those analytic failures. Zeller is correct. I watched that clip yesterday on MSNBC. Zeller's correct, and I have empathy for his anger. You can hear the anger in his voice. People don't want to listen to outside experts. That groupthink is pervasive all through government. The military thinks that they're smarter than everybody else. and they're not going to take outside ideas on evacuating either personnel or friendly Afghans. You know how many people, thousands probably, including family members, thousands of Afghans who've dedicated their lives to working with the U.S. government over the last 20 years are going to die now because we've abandoned them in Afghanistan, and we've abandoned them because of improper planning, that we thought we were smarter than everybody else, and so our plan was the best, and we didn't want to hear any other plans. And that's what Zeller is so angry about in that clip.
And there's also this sort of false dichotomy that I think I've heard between like planning and intelligence, as if it has to be one or the other. But it seems like it would inevitably be both. If you have bad,
it has to be.
It has to be. If you have bad intel, then you're going to make the wrong plans, and et cetera. If you're making the wrong plans, in some sense, you don't really have any mooring for managing the situation. It doesn't help with it. Jamarl, I've been leading here.
No, you're fine. Yeah, and that's a good point. I mean, if you have bad information, what plans are you going to make with the bad information? Yeah, I agree.
I have to add, too, guys, that any moron who read the papers at any point over the last 20 years could have seen that this was going to happen.
Yes.
You know, why were the generals so shocked by this? Why was the CIA so shocked by this? All you had to do was look at a map and read the papers every once in a while.
What did they, what were their plans in regards to people who worked with the United States? I mean, because for all intents and purposes, if people are just making an assumption, and if they're going to say, okay, well, we expect the Taliban to be what the Taliban was prior, then anybody that was a collaborator with the U.S. over the course of the last 20 years, their life was under threat, at the very least under threat. Whether or not they go through with it, whether or not they go with these kind of killings, it's unknown, but at the very least, that should have been the assumption. And yet, that didn't seem to be planned all that much. I mean, what was the expectation? That we had a huge amount of time, like we had weeks. And so within those weeks, we could slowly get rid of the people who worked with us? Was that the plan?
Yeah, that was the plan. And the thought was that we had months rather than weeks. And it turned out we had, days. But the thought was that over the course of months, we would take these employees and their families and we would resettle them in the United States. Or if any other country was willing to take them, the UK already said that they would take some of them. We could send them to those countries for resettlement. The Department of Homeland Security was in charge of that. The Immigration and Naturalization Service was taking the lead, but it never got advanced enough to the point where INS was able to do anything about it. The CIA has statutory authority to resettle, I think it's 30 people a year. At least when I was there, it was 30 people a year. So if there were, people who were good sources or had risked their lives in service of the CIA, we could just put them on a plane, take them to the United States, and give them instantaneous American citizenship. I don't recall that ever being done when I was there. I'm sure there was probably, a Russian defector every once in a while or whatever.
If we did 30 people a day, I'm sorry for interrupting. If we did 30 people a day at this point, we'd still lose most of them, right?
Yeah. And this was 30 people a year.
Yeah.
That's astonishing.
Yeah.
I mean, considering it's been 20 years, the number of people when you think about Europe, for example, during the Syrian war, we had these kind of weird situations where militants backed by the CIA were fighting militants backed by the military. But you had a huge number of refugees that basically slammed into Europe, destabilizing the politics of Europe, despite the fact that it was the United States that was basically pushing those wars and going into one country after the next. And so it's a bit rich now to be like, yeah, we get about 30 a year from the standpoint of CIA. And all of these people, like the guy said, 80, let's say 100,000, are basically left in the lurch. That's astonishing. The Taliban has announced amnesty for, I guess, people who used to work with the government and is urging women to join the government. So and tell me what you think about this. Taliban 2.0. I've said, and I could be entirely wrong on this, and this is just a prognostication thing. We're going to see what happens. But that you may get a more sophisticated Taliban than you did that was having these kind of, cutting off limbs in the middle of a soccer stadium or killing women in the middle of a soccer stadium for some kind of faux pas. Especially if they're trying to form something that, while not technically an Afghanistan government, kind of an Afghan government in the way that it's bringing in other parts of the country that they didn't control, but yet it's still a Taliban government. So my, and tell me what you think about this. Taliban 2.0. I've said, and I could be entirely wrong on this, and this is just a prognostication thing. We're going to see what happens. But that you may get a more sophisticated Taliban than you did that was having these kind of, being in the middle of a soccer stadium or killing women in the middle of a soccer stadium for some kind of faux pas. Especially if they're trying to form something that, while not technically an Afghan government, kind of an Afghan government in the way that it's the first time around. Are you seeing signs of that? I mean, is this just talk? Is this just talk to kind of bring down hysteria in order to calm nerves or whatever else? Or is this a more sophisticated Taliban? For example, the internet. Are they going to have the internet on? Is there going to be power throughout the country? Is there going to be health care? Like, I'm trying to understand, like, what do you expect from the standpoint of the mechanics of the country going forward with this, I don't know, Taliban 2.0?
Well, I think that they're not stupid. I think that they learned lessons from Taliban 1.0. And so I think it's more important for them. I believe they believe it's more important for them to curry favor with the Chinese, for example, with an eye toward economic development, than to start rounding up enemies and executing them in soccer stadiums again. So while we may see that at some point, I think in these early days, they're going to try to put their best face on, especially toward the West, and then cultivate the Chinese.
Very interesting. China, Russia.
Well, remember, let me say one other thing. Remember that the Chinese have an exclusive contract in Afghanistan to mine rare earth metals. And the Pentagon estimates that contract as being worth $1 trillion.
Jeez.
So the Chinese and the Taliban have an incentive to work together on this. $1 trillion can go a long way to develop the country, especially if the Taliban isn't having to fight anybody.
Yes. Okay. Well, and how about Pakistan and India? Let's turn to them for a minute.
Yeah. So that's a great question. You know, the Pakistanis, of course, created the Taliban. It was Benazir Bhutto who the word Taliban means students. It's the plural of Talib, student. And what happened was in the 1990s, Pakistani trucks crossing Afghanistan on their way to Iran were being hijacked. And so Benazir Bhutto came up with this program to take students out of the madrasas, Taliban from the madrasas, and to put them on the trucks with an AK-47 to protect the truck driver and the cargo as they crossed Afghanistan. And then when that began working, they came up with this idea that perhaps it would be better just to station these students in the villages along the highway across Afghanistan instead of riding in the trucks all the time. And so these Taliban took up residence in villages and then took over the villages. And that's how the Taliban began. This was a creation of the Pakistani government. So the Pakistanis, you know, in a sense, have won. My view was always that there were two Pakistans. There was the Pakistan that was working with us, where everybody was trained in the UK and trained by the CIA and MI6, and they were great on counterterrorism. And then there was the other Pakistan that created the Taliban, that armed the Taliban, that financed the Taliban, and the two were constantly at war with each other. The Indians are different. The Indians were very supportive of the Afghan government, really the Afghan government of Hamid Karzai, to the point where the Taliban blew up the Indian embassy in Kabul and killed a whole bunch of people. So the Indians have no love for the Taliban. They have no love, certainly, for the Pakistanis. And I think that if the Indians choose to remain involved in Afghanistan, it's going to be bloody.
And one more question here, and this ties China back in as well, of course. Kashmir, the region, heavily contested region. How would you see Taliban run Afghanistan getting involved in that, contributing to that, pitting its influence on any one of those sides? Probably on the side of Pakistan, of course. But John, what's your take on Kashmir?
If that were to happen, they would come down, of course, on the side of the Pakistanis. The Indians are far more powerful than the Pakistanis care to admit. And that's why Pakistan has resorted to terrorist attacks in Kashmir rather than launching a concerted military move in Kashmir. Now, if the Taliban were to become involved in Kashmir, and I'm not sure that they would because they have too much on their plate right now, I think we would see an uptick in terrorist attacks, but not an actual military move.
Interesting. Very interesting conversation. John, great talking with you. Hope you had a wonderful time in the Aegean and looking forward to seeing you back in the studio.
Thank you so much for that.
Hey, great talking. And John Kiriakou joining us. You just heard his voice, former CIA officer, co-host of The Backstory that's on Radio Sputnik, and author of books including The CIA Insider's Guide to the Iran Crisis and The Reluctant Spy. Follow John on Twitter at John Kiriakou. Learn more about him at johnkiriakou.com. And check out The Backstory. That's on every Monday through Friday here on Radio Sputnik from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Coming back, we're taking your calls. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. Be right back.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history. This week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back, and we're taking your calls, 202-521-1320. I felt almost like I should apologize for it, but I've realized, with the advice of our boss, that I should stop apologizing for things. But this like clinical interest in the future of Afghanistan, the future of the Taliban government. Yeah. Like I have a completely unemotional intellectual curiosity about where the country's going, despite them being terrorists, despite the Taliban being broadly people I don't like. Just what their government is going to look like. And it's, again, like a clinical, almost like a medical, like, what is this going to turn into, watching it?
Well, you don't live there, though.
We don't live there.
So it's not the same, it's not pound of flesh type connection.
And I'm not having to stand up against them locally.
Right.
And,
it's like I'm not being shot at, I'm not the guy on the wall that you're shot at and I'm jumping on the other end of the wall.
Not having to go to war there.
No.
Come back from one.
So I understand where you're coming from. No, I have a phenomenal fascination about this. I mean, war and peace stuff, I'm always enamored by anyway. Especially when you get into the kind of the politics of leverage and how that stuff is exerted, used. And, this brings the Taliban stuff into play. That's why I keep asking, like, what is that? What is it? A government with Taliban characteristics, something like that. And what does it look like? And if you need to make deals with, let's say, China and Russia or Pakistan or some of the other countries that are in the region that seem to be open diplomatically and making strides diplomatically to work with these guys, what does it look like? And does the need for those connections, for economic stability and whatnot, does that create a leverage to moderate behavior?
Yeah.
And, so it's very, we spent trillions of dollars and we're watching something disintegrate before our eyes. And so it would be weird to not want to know what this looks like going forward, especially in regards to women in the country. I know people are using this kind of weird feminist argument to try to argue that we should stay forever because of, women, as if the bombs that we dropped somehow dodged women, or that the sanctions that we put into play somehow didn't help women, or that the radicalization of many of these guys when we were using them to fight the Soviets, that didn't have a detrimental effect on women. One of the mayors made the point of saying, I'm going to sit here and wait for the Taliban to come and kill me and my family. And it's like, oh, that's so dark and that's so horrendous. But does this woman know that we radicalized these guys to fight the Soviets? And so the monsters that are coming to get you are monsters on some level that we had part in hand in creating.
It's true, but that's what gets screwed up about this. If we'd had a different way of approaching this, maybe we could have done something different. But
I think so too.
But like,
I don't think
we created them. And so in some sense, you can argue we have a responsibility to stop them, but we never confronted the fact that we created them in any of this. In any of the public conversation, any of the surface level conversation about this stuff. And the approach that we took was never going to really get rid of them, you know? None of it made sense, but there's something there. We got a couple of callers. One quick point, just on the form of government. If Scott was saying this right, it would be an elective monarchy. Scott Ritter, when we were talking yesterday, he was saying basically he thinks the Loya Jirgas did revert back to the way they had done things. In the 30s, I believe, almost 100 years ago, with the Loya Jirgas effectively electing a single leader to rule the country, which would be an elective monarchy, which is only in like a country or two, less like Malaysia and the Vatican at this point. Just interesting. We got callers that we should go to. We got Tarif calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Thanks for taking my call. Free Julian Science. First of all, I'd like to say I got 2 comments. The HaitiActionCommittee.com. Please, people go there to help out Haiti. Haiti Emergency Relief Fund. All.org. Please go down to help out Haiti. Okay, Biden administration. It's my first comment. Biden administration might have leaked out CIA people information when they took that photo with him in the office. So there's people complaining about that on the internet. In my last comment, U.S. military, John Kirby came out and said no planes will be going in right now, military or civilian. That gave me a hint, that idea that them and the Taliban in new negotiations, you might see the release of some people coming out of the Guantanamo Bay, because now the U.S. military and civilians is in the kill box. The Taliban control the area, which means if any helicopters, or I think if any helicopters, airplanes, C-130s or C-17s land, they might come under fire. So right now, the Taliban got that area secure, and they really don't have to take the airport. All they have to do is just sit back and just stop the air traffic from landing, which means basically the servicemen and the civilians is being held hostage already from a tactical standpoint. So, yeah, it's not really good right now.
Wait, Tarif, say that one more time. You're saying that the airport, that the Taliban has taken the airport, or they've surrounded the airport. Is that what you're saying? Say it one more time.
The airport that the Taliban has surrounded, the Taliban is now, I feel to believe, is in control of aircraft.
Well, they are, but it seems like they're allowing evacuations to take place. It seems like they're allowing that stuff to go through.
Oh, they are?
Yeah, we were reporting that. And by the way, did you hear that we talked with Jemima Pierre this morning? Just giving you the heads up. Don't know if you heard that.
All right. Well, because John Kirby came out and said yesterday that they had stopped all military traffic.
Military traffic's one thing. All I know is they have what I'm hearing is they've begun to evacuate again. They've opened those back up basically.
And maybe a deal was made between them and the Taliban, or maybe, I don't know.
And also civilian flights are different from military flights. You're talking military flights there.
Evacuation flights restarts from Kabul after Afghans desperate to flee cleared airfield. This was August 17th, 2021, a few minutes ago.
We also, an interesting point, I hadn't seen the thing with Biden outing the CIA agents. This is what you're talking about, where basically he took a photo in the Situation Room of him on one side of the table, and then on the other side of the room, you can see on the screen, they have it blurred out in the thing I'm looking at right now, but he's talking to like 8 people.
Yeah.
And in the original photograph, their faces were unblurred, and basically he's outing agents. It was just incompetent, a bad move. Tarif, thank you for the call. Briefly, we've only got a minute for this, but let's go to Max calling in from Maryland. Max, you're on. Briefly, what's on your mind?
Hey, my entire adult life we've been over there, and I just wanted to bring up, when John was bringing up terms like Taliban and people bring up terms like ISIS or all of these fighters, the original term was Mujahideen, and these people ran the country during the Soviet occupation, and the idea that we didn't complete our mission, it's one of these narratives that they're trying to rewrite. What we were there to do was survive 20 years, which was longer than the Soviets, which was longer than the British. It's a game of attrition. And the idea that they're telling our soldiers that they didn't complete their mission is horrible.
But wait, a game of attrition for whom? We're the ones, we're the ones on the losing side of this Fabian war, right?
Yeah, but sometimes you cross in. Sometimes your empire, your empirical destiny, you must show that you can fight. You must show that you have the ability to...
and lose? Show that you can fight and lose? If you fight the right wars, it surely shows more competence than fighting the wrong ones, right? I mean, we got to... Interesting point, but fighting in Afghanistan for longer and losing harder than the Soviets doesn't exactly trump them, Max. Max, thank you for the call, though. We got to go into our break. We're going to be coming back in a minute with headlines and the last hour of this morning's show. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the United States, it's time now for the last hour this morning of the most disruptive show covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states we call America and from across the increasingly divided surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Jane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Get into the headlines. For a heads up for folks, it's August 17th, just after 9 a.m. Eastern. Hope everybody's having a great morning. In COVID news, there are about 252,000 new COVID cases reported yesterday in the United States. Also about 1,000 new deaths, just over 1,000 new deaths. That 252,000 mark, by the way, we've only seen a handful of days in the history of this pandemic that have exceeded that count in terms of new cases. So in other words, we are back. I'm not saying if this continues, we'll be back up at the peak. I'm not saying we're back up at the peak, but for this single day yesterday, we were like way right up there, right?
Over 1,000 dead again.
Over 1,000 dead. Yeah.
That number had gotten down to what, 200?
200. Yeah, it was some days just 2 digits, double digits.
Yeah.
Remember?
Well.
This comes as over the past week, there have been an average of about 141,000 cases per day. That's an increase of 64% from the average 2 weeks earlier. Same increase as yesterday, by the way, even though the cases have gone up. And this is the thing with like exponentiation, is that even though the numbers keep, it just keeps like almost doubling. It keeps rising and rising in size compared to where it was, which means it can quickly get very out of control. 51% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and 60% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected about 37 million people across the United States. It's also killed 622,244 people. U.S. experts are expected to recommend COVID-19 vaccine boosters for Americans of all ages 8 months after they receive their second dose. Boosters will only be administered after the FDA formally approves the vaccine. New Zealand has declared a nationwide lockdown after detecting its first COVID case in over 6 months. New Zealand has been notable for effectively no community transmission for the most of the history of this pandemic, for a good chunk of it at least. Like, I believe nearly half. 6 months in a row, and there were periods of months on end where they had no community transmission. Again, island nation, but they're doing something right, I suppose. In national news, yesterday, major U.S. oil companies sued the Biden administration for halting drilling auctions on federal land and waters this year. They state that the government is required by law to hold regular sales. During his campaign, Biden promised to stop issuing new leases to oil and gas companies as part of his agenda to combat climate change. His administration paused drilling auctions in January, pending review of the program's environmental impacts and value to taxpayers. Bob Dylan, famous American musician, is now facing allegations of sexual abuse dating back 50 years to 1965, when a woman now accuses Dylan of plying her with drinks and drugs at the age of 12 and then molesting her for 6 weeks while effectively keeping her in captivity. Again, an accusation made against Dylan 55, 56 years ago, but still one worth hearing out. I'm inclined to protect Bob Dylan because I like his music.
You say you are?
Because I like his music, but
so long ago, 50 years ago.
Yeah, 55, 56 years ago.
This always gets to the question of redemption, stuff like that. Like, say for the moment that he did it, and I'm not saying he did it, I'm just saying.
No, he's not redeemed. I'm sorry. That's too bad. That's too bad. That shows too much malintent. It's like, okay, if you do that, suddenly you're a psychopath.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. Fair enough.
Right?
Well, I'm asking. I mean, like, is there such thing? Like, let's take it out of Bob Dylan. Let's take it out of reality for a moment and take it to vampires. Let's say you have somebody who did something, I don't know, 300 years prior. Can you ever make up for whatever it was? Like, let's say you killed somebody, or let's say you did this, what they're accusing Bob Dylan of. Can you make up for it 300 years later?
I don't know. You're asking God's question.
It's a difficult question to ask.
You can ask, can I forgive this person? And if you're Sookie Stackhouse, you for sure will, Jamarl. You know what I'm talking about. You watch True Blood. But
no, but you know what I mean. It's redemption is always hard for me because it's like Michael Vick. That was another good one where it's like the dog thing. It's like, can Michael Vick ever redeem himself to me? Probably not. No, probably not. By the same token, can he redeem himself to some people? Maybe.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, what about if he does good works, and what if he does this? What if he does that? But that gets really to the core of this question of redemption. 50 years is so long ago, and like you said, but that is so vicious.
Yes, a 12-year-old keeping her drunk and high so that he can abuse, assault, molest her for 6 weeks, a month and a half.
Also, I have a hard time believing if it's just one, it would only just be one. That's so sadistic.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, but, you hear all this stuff, and I want to give it its due coverage, but also I don't want to assume that anything about it is true before getting too deep into it.
No, not at all. It's just intellectual.
Right now, in international news, Biden's speech on Afghanistan will respond with devastating force to any attacks on Americans. He criticized the Afghan army for losing its will to fight. We've been playing clips throughout the show this morning. We'll be playing them again soon. I'm sure of it. We're planning on talking with Matthew Ho in a couple of minutes. And again, talking about Afghanistan, big deal here. But him blaming the Afghan army, the clip that I've been playing from Matt Zeller on MSNBC, where he's like, these people... For every life an American lost, they lost, and he didn't give a number.
It's like 100,000 troops of Afghanistan.
Yes, a lot of people died on a constant, regular basis. Yeah. And then we're blaming them, I guess, for not being willing to fight for us, for our government, our propped-up government. Anyway, 2 days after taking Kabul, the Taliban has urged government officials in the city to return to work. They've also encouraged women to work with the government, interestingly enough. The international airport in Kabul has reopened evacuations. They're undergoing evacuations again. Reportedly, there is no music coming from the city, or at least very little of it, and women are scarce. Heard that from the BBC this morning, which was just interesting color commentary for them to add in, where they were saying their source on the ground tells them you don't see women around, you don't hear any music.
Well, because that's the new thing now.
Yes.
Like Marianne Williamson even has been on Twitter screaming that we should be there. It's not anti-imperialism to... What is it? Her argument is basically we should be there because of women, because they mistreat women.
Yes.
And it's like, that's so shallow. And yet that's her push. Right. She's even gone so far as to say it's not an occupation.
Sexist, you sexist, Jamarl.
I know, right? I know. But yeah, I think they're way off base. But that's the new trope. Oh, we got to stay because of the women.
Yeah.
And it's like, certainly you didn't invade because of the women. Certainly the bombs didn't help the women. The sanctions in the various countries didn't help the women. Your support for Saudi Arabia didn't help the women. The radicalizing these guys didn't help the women. None of the stuff has been beneficial to women.
Because there are at least two different arguments here. One is, do we have the right to control other people, which is fundamentally philosophical. And then there's, can we practically control other people, which is very practical.
Yeah.
And the second one, the answer is clearly no. And the first one, it's easy for us to confuse these conversations. Like, do we have the right to convince Taliban to take them over? That's a separate thing from if we could like snap our fingers and magically they would suddenly love and revere and respect women on a par with men and, adhere to modern day definitions of feminism or whatever, those kinds of things. If we could do that, a lot of people probably would. That's a philosophical question, though. Practically, the answer is almost certainly no, we could not have done that.
You don't have power to do that.
Therefore, what do you do with that? More headlines, though. In tech news, federal authorities are investigating Tesla for at least 11 accidents involving autopilot or other self-driving features, specifically accidents featuring emergency vehicles such as fire engines and ambulances. The 11 accidents recorded led to 17 injuries and 1 death. In Earth and Science news, the first ever U.S. water shortage was declared yesterday on a reservoir supplying Arizona and Nevada. The states, which are both affected by drought, will begin to cut water use from the new year. Officials are blaming the problem on climate change, although I'd wager and would argue there are many other factors also relevant, but, a little bit more under our control directly than climate change, which is a long, long process. In other words, the agricultural stuff that I was talking about yesterday with California and shipping in water from as far away as Canada, those are proximate conditions that we can control directly, that we could stop, could change to keep this from becoming a further crisis. I have no doubt that climate, and I've seen it, climate change exacerbates this, but it's sort of shifting the responsibility, shifting the focus and the locus of our concern from one thing that's under our control to another. It's like this big looming thing that every country in the world has to work together on. You get my point.
Yeah, I do get your point. It's too big. It's easy to blame it on climate change and say, oh, it's climate change, so we can't touch it.
Exactly.
No, we have things that we can control.
No, there are things, exactly. There are things politicians in the West could be controlling and influencing. Instead, they refer this back to national level politicians to answer, who refer to the other countries to answer. It becomes this big passing of the buck upwards. NASA's Perseverance Mars rover's first rock sample has gone missing. The metallic tube expected to hold a sample was examined, and it was found to be empty. Basically, it bored drilled a little hole into the ground. It's supposed to have extracted some dirt, some of the, not soil, but let's call it soil.
Watch rocks.
The sample.
Yeah.
Exactly. I hesitate to call it soil because I think technically soil has to have organic materials in it. But anyway, the earth there, the crust, they try to pick it up. it brings it into the little internal mechanism. It reads it, and it basically shows it as empty. Now, they're saying that the mechanism didn't malfunction. The mechanism was fine, which I don't completely understand, because, like, wait. Did it teleport? Exactly.
Yeah.
They're saying the problem was with like the sampling or with taking the sample or something. Maybe I'm just misunderstanding it.
Yeah.
And it actually makes perfect sense. That's probably what's happening. Anyway, they have not done that. This is a big deal, though, because if we can get those pristine samples, they can analyze them, shipping them back home to Earth. We can analyze that on site. A bunch of different people can see what's going on there, and we might learn a lot more about not just Mars, but, you know, formation of planets and other very interesting things.
Not to mention, if there's life.
Yes.
I mean, one of the if I remember correctly, it had something to do with the building blocks, where they were seeing something.
Water?
No, I don't know if it was water, but it was something that they were seeing, that they were getting some kind of organic compounds or something. That
was not Mars. I think you're thinking about the.
Am I thinking Venus?
Phosphine and Venus. Phosphine gas.
I'm thinking of Venus. Okay.
Phosphine gas and the cloud decks of Venus.
That's what it is. That's what it is. That's what it is.
I remember. You ever see Blade Runner?
Yes.
You remember the famous monologue where he's like, I've seen. I forget what the actual line is.
Yeah.
I've seen teardrops glimmer.
The robot that was just before he died.
Exactly, and I'm just thinking of, and I've seen phosphine gas in the cloud decks of Venus.
But they're trying to see if there are organic materials in the dust and the dirt on Mars.
Yeah.
And, you know, part of that is, you know, getting it and bringing it back here, or some kind of analysis there on the planet. And long story short, something went wrong.
Yeah, it's absolutely correct. In business news, the man who popularized the game Sudoku has died at the age of 69 after seeing the game in a magazine under the name Number Place. Maki Kaji renamed it Sudoku and released it in a Japanese magazine in 1984. That's long before he saw the rise of the game to international popularity and success about 20 years ago, the turn of the millennium. And with that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. What New Zealand did to effectively make this work is they just shut off travel. They just cut off travel with other countries. And whoop, that solves their problem because, again, they're an island nation. Not a lot of countries have that liberty, but probably more do than we think. Probably the United States could have done that. I don't want to keep going back to this one specifically. I guess I got into a conversation last week. I was a sort of guest host for an hour on my dad's show over in The Backstory.
Yeah.
And towards the end of that, we interviewed Dr. Roger Hodkinson, who like flipped out and left pissed because I had been questioning him kind of hard during the interview.
Why?
What'd you say?
Why?
Well,
he left pissed?
He left pissed and then told us to F ourselves. You can go back and listen to it.
Really?
I was being a bit aggressive, but I wasn't like cutting the guy off or not letting him speak. I was just arguing with him.
What was he a doctor of?
And the first time, I think it's something pretty relevant.
Okay.
I'd have to go back and look, but I think he was like a pathologist or I don't know, more specific than that. But anyway, we got into this argument. It was a bit, he left, he bailed. And we got callers, and the callers were kind of siding with him. Anyway, it was a good argument overall. But what it reminded me of is we were talking about the testing, the PCR tests,
right,
and how he said they didn't work.
That's not true.
Well,
they can be iffy.
He said if you run them too many cycles, and this is true, if you run them through too many cycles, then you get false positives, and the false positive rate goes up. But then I responded, we understood this. This was done and talked about.
Yeah, we knew this in the beginning.
Last year. We knew this from the beginning, and then they adjusted their protocols. And in some cases, sure, you got false positives, but they've been a very successful diagnostic tool because if you look at where cases rise, a couple weeks later, usually you get deaths rising too. They're very useful for tracking the epidemic. Maybe even if every test isn't going to be 100% correct, it's still very useful as a tool.
But you can see case rise, deaths.
Yes.
Like within 2 weeks of each other, almost like clockwork.
Totally.
And so it's like, or hospitalizations.
And here's where I'm going with this. Here's why I'm tying it back to New Zealand. Not just COVID. You can also see this because remember the East Asian and Southeast Asian countries that responded to COVID, they did it in sort of different ways. You had, Taiwan, China, South Korea, Japan. I'll just take those four. I think you can include Singapore too, but just take those four. They all responded in different ways. Some were doing test and trace. Others were doing just complete lockdowns. There were these different versions. Others were doing, more implemented style quarantines. Some had more of a focus on apps. Others were doing more testing, simply testing, et cetera. But they had these different approaches. And broadly, all of their approaches seem to work really damn well compared to ours. And then there are these questions. Were they less susceptible to COVID because a lot of people previously had caught SARS, which kind of doesn't make sense, but I'm just going to put those aside for just a second. My point is what they did worked, but there were these interesting strategies that they were competing with here. Yeah. New Zealand is another one of those strategies. New Zealand, insular country, decided to lock down all travel like some of these other ones did. It's just another way to solve this problem.
Yeah.
And if we're looking to solve it truly, ideally we look at what these countries have done, right? That's the only thing that you can look to.
Yeah.
Unless you're trying something new, of course. But for proven success, you look at their track record.
Yeah, because New Zealand did exceptional with it. I mean, granted, like you said, it's an island nation, so they had the capability of like shutting stuff down. But, you know, there was also this thing of public was on board for the policies that they were putting forth. We, in this country, had people who didn't even want to wear masks. I mean, you still have fights over masks, talking about wearing masks is against my liberty. You're breaching my liberty because I have to wear a mask. That nonsense. Or people were getting into fights because the store clerk would say, hey, sir, could you please put on a mask? You're going to make other people in the store sick. I mean, so, you know, it's even that. More than 5,000 students in one Florida county either tested positive for COVID or is currently in quarantine, officials say. Florida, if I remember correctly, Florida and Texas have like 40% of all the cases in the United States. Meaning, to back up your point, the PCR testing, no, it's not 100% perfect, but it was a good predictive tool in regards to whether or not somebody had it or not. And like you said, you could see from the hospitalizations, you could see from the people that were dying, all of those things seem to correlate with one another. There wasn't a situation where heavy amount of cases, death dropped precipitously. They were always in tandem with one another. You can look at it. We were reading the stats pretty much every day. So yeah, I agree with you on that. But yeah, I mean, 1,000 deaths a day is appalling. And I'm saying that because we read the numbers every day. And we were there when the numbers were at, like you said, double digits. And the numbers started to peak up a little bit more, to the point now where children, who a lot of people are arguing, oh, kids don't get sick. Kids aren't an issue. Kids aren't infected. Nonsense. You have kids now who have spiked in the number of kids who are infected with COVID. So, yeah, I agree with you on this. Whatever the failings or whatever the difficulties of the tests, to say that they don't work seems absurd.
It spiraled out of control. But, but you know, it was still a good interview, still a good conversation. Let's close it out. We're going to be coming back with Matthew Ho, continuing the conversation on Afghanistan. Coming back to that, we've been talking about that, of course, extensively today, all day yesterday. Throughout our entire show yesterday. That was our coverage. And we're hitting it again in a minute. Matthew Ho, for those listening, first-time guest on this show, nearly 12 years of experience with American wars overseas with the Marines. He resigned from the State Department for his post in Afghanistan with the State Department over the American escalation of the war. We're going to be going into his story, what he thinks about what he's seen in the days and weeks that have passed recently, that have seen the Taliban take over Afghanistan much more quickly than the United States was fearful of, at least in its appraisals and its briefings given to the president. In the president's statements in his speech yesterday, we were completely shocked by this. We're going to Matthew Ho to explain it for us. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. We've been having a conversation today about Afghanistan. Earlier in the day, we talked about Haiti. Exceptional conversation. Definitely tune into it. That was at 7:30. But we've been having a conversation with John Kiriakou on Afghanistan. This was in the 8 o'clock hour. But we're going to have a conversation with Matthew Ho. We've just left Afghanistan. You could say tail between our legs after 20 years, trillions spent, hundreds of thousands of lives lost. And the question at this point becomes, why? What did we get out of it? Or did we get anything out of it? What are the lessons to learn from this? And what is going to take place going forward with Afghanistan? Not to mention the very basic question, how did this all go so wrong? To have a conversation, we're joined with Matthew Ho. He's nearly 12 years experience with American wars overseas in the United States Marine Corps, Department of Defense, and the State Department. He resigned in protest from his post in Afghanistan with the State Department over the American escalation of the war. Matthew took part in the American occupation of Iraq and worked on Afghanistan and Iraq war policy and operations issues at the Pentagon and the State Department. Matthew, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate you coming on.
Hi, good morning. Well, thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. We have been thinking about you for a while, trying to get you on because you are like the perfect person to talk to about this. I want to just start from the beginning. How did this go so wrong? And, you know, we can start back in the very first part of the conflict with after 9/11 and the ramp up to war, or you can start in the beginning, however you want to frame it. But basically, how did this go so wrong? I just leave it as an open question.
Well, I mean, the war begins. I mean, this is a living legacy of the Cold War. Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. I can't remember if I just said that or not, but thank you. Anyway, this is a living legacy of the Cold War. I mean, this really has its originations, you know, in the modern sense, in 1973 when the king is deposed. Mm-hmm. And since 1973, for almost 50 years now, Afghanistan is really known, you know, at best, political chaos, and more often than not, flat-out war. So what really I think is the story about this is not so much about the internal conflict of Afghanistan, the civil war. There's certainly that. I mean, I don't want to take any agency away from the Afghans, but I don't know how you can look at what has occurred in the last, you know, 5 decades and not understand the heavy hand, you know, the manipulation, the control of foreign powers in Afghanistan. And I think the most tragic aspect about all this, because the Afghans have just had unimaginable suffering. You know, it's just we could be here all day trying to describe to an audience in the United States or elsewhere what conditions are like there. But I mean, it's been 5 decades of war. And so the cost to every Afghan has just been immense, and the cost to future generations of Afghans will be immense as well. But, you know, the tragedy, the great part of that tragedy is that these wars have had little to nothing to do with the Afghans themselves. When the Soviet, you know, the idea behind the United States funding the Mujahideen before the Soviet Union invades in 1979, you know, the idea by Zbigniew Brzezinski, Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, was to bait the Soviet Union into a trap, you know, to cause them to invade Afghanistan, to give the Soviets their own Vietnam. You know, and I mean, and from there you can just understand the consequences. You know, the results of, you know, the violence in Afghanistan, the attempts by foreign nations to manipulate outcomes that they had no ability to actually ever deliver on. But, you know, and then all the things that have occurred since then because of that. And again, because the United States or other nations were trying to utilize Afghanistan for their own purposes. And when I say Afghanistan, what has happening there has a little to do with the Afghans. It's mainly got that is in the idea of, you know, the United States starts arming rebel groups in Afghanistan because of the Soviet Union, not because of anything specific to Afghanistan other than its proximity to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, in many ways, if you look at the Politburo documents on their decision to invade the Soviet Union. They talk about how the United States had just lost its bases in Iran, and if the Soviets didn't go into Afghanistan, well, the Americans would go into Afghanistan, and the Soviets couldn't let that happen, right? I mean, on, and of course, 9/11 happened after many years of other similar type stories, and 9/11 wasn't about the Afghans. No Afghans were involved. At best, you can describe Afghanistan as a hotel that Osama bin Laden and his people were staying at. I mean, Al-Qaeda at that point on 9/11 was an organization less than 400 people strong worldwide. And the 9/11 attacks had, very little regarding 9/11 attacks happened in Afghanistan. The majority of the planning and training took place in Pakistan, Germany, here in the United States at, the American flight academies and martial arts academies. So again, had very little to do with the Afghans. There's quite a famous episode in around 2010, 2011. An organization went to southern Afghanistan and asked people down in southern Afghanistan if they'd heard of 9/11, and about 95% of them had never heard of 9/11. And this was nearly 10 years after the United States had been in Afghanistan, directly following 9/11. So I think, there's a lot that can be said about this, but I think the primary thing I would say is that these wars in Afghanistan, going back to the 70s, have never been about the Afghans, but they are the ones who have bore the suffering. How did we get here today? Well, the reason why is because, the United States tried to manipulate and control things, tried to use a divide and conquer strategy, and set up a system in Afghanistan where the men with the guns rule, and that is what happened. One brutal group just defeated another brutal group, because anyone who thinks that the Afghan government was anything like the people who are apologizing for the war, describing it as, is just doesn't know what they're talking about. The Afghan government was incredibly brutal, predatory, about nearly as misogynistic as the Taliban was. They weren't executing women in the stadium, but everything else they were doing was the same as the brutal Taliban rule over women in many ways, in many parts. That's how you get here. You try and you have this strategy that, again, pits one side against another in a civil war, sets up a predatory, corrupt government, and at the end of it, no one's going to support that. And what we have seen, which is very surprising, is a lot of support for the Taliban in areas that the Taliban historically did not have support. In areas that Taliban is primarily a Pashtun movement, and what we have seen in the last months are areas going over the Taliban that are non-Pashtun.
And we were talking about that with other guests recently too. That the prospect of creating a government, a nation-state modern government run by the Taliban. If you're only representing a single ethnic minority, even though it's almost a majority, the Pashtun, it's almost 50% of the population. It's large enough to almost qualify as the majority in the country. Still, if they're only representing them, it's going to be inherently a fragmented country. And we've been talking about successfully making inroads with ethnic minorities, specifically the Tajiks and the Uzbeks in the north. Interesting conversation there. I wanted to, Jamarl set us up by asking, how did we get here? What was the road here, basically? I'm curious, your personal road here, because you've got a story. We've got to go to a break in a couple of minutes, but can you briefly set us up? How did you get here? Matthew?
I was in the Marine Corps, and I was in the Iraq War twice, and I worked on Marine Corps and Afghan issues. And when I was in the Iraq War, I had been on a State Department team, a Reconstruction and Governance team, and I have worked at the State Department on the Iraq desk. And so I knew people at the State Department. And so when the United States began expanding the war in 2008, the State Department began expanding as well. And I ended up with an appointment into the Foreign Service and went to Afghanistan and saw that the Afghan war, with my own eyes, saw that the Afghan war was no different than the Iraq war, that it was built upon and sustained upon all the same lies, and that our presence there was incredibly counterproductive. And at that point, I was morally and intellectually broken. And after 5 months there, I resigned in protest over the escalation of the war by the Obama administration because, it just was. I knew it was going to only bring more suffering and be futile. And the logical conclusion of that was what we've seen this past week. This is what would happen. And so I resigned in protest. And 12 years later, still speaking about the war.
I'm curious about Biden's original position on this, because even though Donald Trump was, we're going to take us out, Biden is the one who basically had to carry it through. And ultimately, the buck stops with Biden, and the way that Biden said the buck stops with him in regards to how this turned out, meaning the leaving and having basically explicitly happen what he said wouldn't happen. This looking like Saigon with people hanging off of airplanes as the U.S. troops tried to leave, or for that matter, us leaving a huge number of personnel that were collaborating with us. To bolster your point for a bit, this is the Afghanistan Files, Washington Post. Quote, it was impossible, and this is talking about the surge for Obama. It was impossible to create good metrics. We tried using troop numbers, trained, violence levels, control of territory, and none of it painted an accurate picture. They even go further. It says, even when casualty counts and other figures look bad, the senior NSC official said the White House and Pentagon would spin them to the point of absurdity. Suicide bombings in Kabul was portrayed as the Taliban being desperate, or insurgents were too weak to engage in combat. Troop deaths were proof that the American troops were actually fighting or taking the fight to the enemy. This even gets worse. Rumsfeld, quote, Rumsfeld, 5 years on, there's a multitude of good news, it reads, while it's become fashionable in some circles to call Afghanistan a forgotten war or say that the United States has lost its focus, the facts belie the myth. And this goes into this kind of document where Rumsfeld knew was full of lies and yet was still there to sell the war. I'm curious on what Biden's position was initially for the war. Biden takes a position saying that he was always against the surge, or that he didn't believe that this would ever work. What was the position of Biden as a vice president under Obama during the troop surge?
Yeah, I don't know if I can curse on your radio show or not, so I won't. But no, Biden started off his speech to the American public and by extension to the Afghan public, although I don't think it was labeled that way to the White House. I mean, that's one thing, is that the Afghans have always been, at best, secondary to American concerns. At best, I mean, that is, one of the things that I think when you talk about this war and any notion of justice and accountability needs to be addressed. But no, in 2009, so President Obama, Barack Obama, comes in office in 2009. There's 30,000 NATO troops and about half that number. I'm sorry, 30,000 American troops and about half that number of NATO troops and about equivalent number of contractors there at that time. By the end of his first year and a half in office, there are now 100,000 American troops, 40,000 NATO troops, more than 100,000 contractors. So Barack Obama comes into office. There's roughly about 60,000, 70,000 U.S. NATO troops and contractors. Within a year and a half, there's 250,000 U.S. NATO troops and contractors in Afghanistan, and that was the surge. Most people consider the surge to have been the decisions, the very public decision-making process in the fall of 2009, where Barack Obama ends up at West Point at the end of the year saying he's going to send 30,000 more troops to Afghanistan. By the time he makes that decision, Barack Obama has already sent 40,000 troops, so he sends a total of 70,000 American troops, plus more NATO troops and about 70,000 more contractors. Joe Biden's plan, and this is one of the lies. I mean, the man starts off with two lies right in his speech yesterday about Afghanistan, and one of his lies was that he opposed the surge in 2009. That is absolutely untrue, and it's verifiable, well documented. Joe Biden's plan for Afghanistan was not to keep it at the status quo, not to pull out troops. His plan was to do a slightly smaller plan than what Barack Obama did. If it had been Joe Biden's plan in 2009 put into action, there would have been 90,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan as opposed to 100,000 U.S. troops. That's Joe Biden's opposition. This is a person who can get up and talk about this war with all its suffering, all its costs, the disaster, the tragedy, the failures of it, and to think that opposition to the war meant there would have been 240,000 troops instead of 250,000 troops. That is Joe Biden's. I think that summarizes Joe Biden's relationship with these wars, his relationship with his own role in them. He was the vice president while the United States chose a strategy of military victory in Afghanistan. From 2001 to 2009, when the Obama administration comes in, the Bush administration chooses to basically kind of ignore the situation in Afghanistan, just hoping it will get better. They begin sending more troops, American troops, to Afghanistan in 2008. But basically decide they're going to leave it, hand it off to the next incoming administration to deal with. I mean, and they're focusing on Iraq, of course. Barack Obama comes in, and at that point, there were plenty of opportunities to negotiate with the Taliban. Again, this is well documented, both whether by government leaks, by statements by former government officials, by press reports, by the Taliban's own reporting the Taliban. This is one of the reasons I resigned. I was in Afghanistan as a State Department political officer. That would have been my job, is to talk with them. And they would. The Taliban would come in to talk to us in 2009. And we were told, our orders were from the embassy and from Washington, D.C., was that we are not doing that. But Joe Biden is the vice president of the administration that not only doesn't just go along with George Bush's policy in Afghanistan, but really hardens it and sharpens it and makes it into one of complete military victory. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. But that's the consequence. And this is how we have ended up or not we, but the Afghans have ended up in this situation with the Taliban taking complete control. Because when you decide that you are going to military defeat your opponent and you lose, this is what happens. This is what losing looks like. And so much commentary in the United States has been infantile, for lack of a better word, the idea that somehow the United States could go and the condition for war be unconditional surrender by the other side, without the expectation that somehow, that if you lose this, if that does not work, you have no other options, and defeat is what is going to happen. So that's Joe Biden's role in it in a lot of ways. He certainly never opposed it, as he stated in his remarks yesterday to the American people.
And you also said there was another lie. You said the two lies. Which other lie did you catch there?
Immediately after he says this about his opposition to the surge into the war in Afghanistan, he says that the United States accomplished its mission, and that the United States had never been to Afghanistan for purposes of nation building. And when he says that, every veteran, every American service member, every contractor, everyone who was over there taking part in the killing recognize that for what it was, an absolute lie. The idea that somehow this wasn't about nation building, then what were, again, this 250,000 man army doing in Afghanistan? The amount, just the sheer amount of money spent on the war, the sheer amount of lives lost and ruined in the purposes of building up the Afghan government, building up the Afghan security forces. The whole counterinsurgency strategy was predicating on connecting the people to the government of Afghanistan. And in order to do that, you have to build we had in 2009, in 2010, General McChrystal, who's in charge of Afghan forces, the highlight, the keystone of the surge is going to be this U.S. Marine Corps offensive into the town of Marja in Helmand province. And I'm sure people recall that the name of this village in the middle of nowhere in Helmand that the focus of the American military and the world for months. And Marja is going to be, we're going to prove how our counterinsurgency strategy works, prove how we can show the Afghans a better way of life, and we have what's called a democracy in the box that we bring to Afghanistan. You know, all the people that they're going to need to help themselves self-govern and stand up a functioning democracy. And I mean, so just the idea that he would say that when everything that occurred in the war proves the opposite. You know, it shows two things. I mean, or maybe more, but it shows two things really clearly to me. One, the complete disregard for the people who were sent there to do that, like the complete disregard for what they think, what they're going to say about it, and then secondly, the knowing that no one is going to hold you accountable on it. I mean, same with his lie about opposing the surge, knowing that he can say that and no one is, there's going to be no accountability for it. You brought up Donald Rumsfeld, you know, just thinking about Rumsfeld earlier, actually, in the fact that there is a man who is able to lead the United States into the invasion of Iraq, say, based completely on lies, and is never held to account for it. You know, by very definition, is a war criminal. And from everything we know, he died without a shred of remorse or guilt, let alone any iota of justice. You know, just a month ago.
And you know what's unfortunate about it? There doesn't seem to be any consequences across the board. I mean, whether you're talking about the media that basically lied in the service of the government for the last 20-something years, not investigatively holding them to account on this stuff, or like you said, Rumsfeld, or Obama, or any of these guys, because all of them were basically lying about the progress of this war. Right here, it's brimming with optimism and highlights more than 50 promising facts and figures from the number of Afghan women trained and improved poultry management to the average speed on most roads. 5 years on, there's a multitude of good news, it reads. And Rumsfeld was like, yeah, this is great. We need to use this. Like, that's what I mean. They were lying all the way through. And so the American public sees the government fall, and they're shocked because from their context, they've been told that everything was going great, that we're winning this thing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What should have happened in Afghanistan? Meaning, let's just from a sliding door universe perspective of this, instead of what did happen, meaning these 40 years of war, or the trying to basically use the Mujahideen as a club in order to hit the Soviets, what should have happened in Afghanistan?
You know, I mean, it's a great. That's I think dissecting that and looking at, and with Afghanistan, we can even go back further. You know, the British in the 19th century invaded Afghanistan on several occasions, and a couple of those at least were very disastrous for the British. At one point, their entire expedition is completely wiped out by the Afghans. And, you know, the reason always for the British to invade Afghanistan from India was because the stated reason was because they were afraid the Russians were going to invade India through Afghanistan. And that was always the argument. That was always the, you know, and then in Britain during the time of the 19th century, very much a who's tougher on Russia, you know, so very similar to what you've seen in the United States in the 20th century and now in this century, now particularly say with China, who's tougher on China. And then, but the thing about that was that century later, when more than a century later, when the Soviet Union falls and historians get into all the archives and they look through all the Tsarist records from the time, the 19th century, they find that there was never once any moment where the Russians had thought about, planned to invade India via Afghanistan. So everything about that would have been made up and generated within the British political system for domestic political reasons. And I think that, I mean, how do you start? I mean, like, again, Afghanistan is a legacy, a living legacy of the Cold War. If we had a time machine and you can go back in time, I don't know where you would land. I mean, would it mean that you'd have to go back to, where was it, Hot Springs, Georgia, where FDR died, and with, a couple of paddles and a cardiac surgeon and keep FDR alive so that we don't have this Cold War, right? That's true, right? Or do you go back to the 1944 Democratic National Convention and get Henry Wallace to become vice president again rather than Truman?
Yeah.
We don't have right? I mean, like, where does history begin? So but I think that the thing to take away, I think, for Americans should be that this is a war of our making. Even, this is because of actions that we chose. And even, say, 9/11, say we make the arbitrary start date of 9/11, which is incorrect, but just say it for the sake of this conversation. Well, in the sense of what we chose to do, the United States chose to do after 9/11 was to go into Afghanistan after a group that was less than 400 people strong. Most of them weren't even in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And particularly after 9/11, most of them left Afghanistan. But, I mean, the idea being that somehow this war had anything to do about Afghanistan, but it was good for domestic political reasons. But we also have a system, and you brought up the Afghan papers and all the lying, that incentivizes lying, that rewards doing what is best for your institution, that rewards, not just personal loyalty in the sense of ladder climbing and careerism and doing what is best in order for you to get promoted, which means keeping your mouth shut and never saying anything.
Yeah.
Also, institutional loyalty. That is the most important thing in Washington, D.C., so you don't speak out, you go along with it, and that's how you have, and the media is completely culpable, you can have 2 decades without anyone, even if you were to take the idea that the United States is there solely because of 9/11, you don't have people saying, well, hey, now that doesn't make sense. None of them were Afghans. Vast 90% of the training, the planning, the preparation took place outside of Afghanistan. Give you an example, the man who was responsible for all the logistics for 9/11, he didn't leave Germany until like 2 or 3 days before the attacks. So all the money, getting the passports, all the logistics of this operation, getting the accommodations, where they're going to live in the United States, et cetera, that guy never leaves at Germany until 2 days before the attacks. How can you tell me this is all about Afghanistan, right? When the United States had hijackers inside the United States for 18 months prior to the attacks.
Yeah.
How can that be about Afghanistan? I mean, where did we catch Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was the real mastermind of the attacks, or seems to have been? He was almost always in Pakistan. I mean, the whole the fact that we don't have that discussion that the United States, those who want this war, who want the war to continue, can say that, well, if we're not in Afghanistan, the Taliban is going to let Al Qaeda come back in, and we'll just have another 9/11. And they can, and the media can just report that breathlessly without, with taking a stop to think about it or any, anything about that narrative of the safe haven is, if you spend more than a couple of minutes thinking about it, it doesn't hold water. It doesn't make sense. In order to keep people from planning an attack like that, you would have to garrison not every town and village in Afghanistan. You'd have to garrison every home. To prevent. Because how much space did the Taliban attackers, the Al-Qaeda attackers, need to plan this? All this planning was done in hotel rooms, in conference rooms, and in people's homes.
The stated justifications don't make sense, and they haven't made sense for a long time. But using it as a positional piece on a chessboard, it's a space for you to move your pawn or whatever, that kind of thing, like you were describing for the 19th century in the Great Game, might have been useful. I just don't see how it was in our case. Somebody could try to make that case, but we were stating different justifications than we actually had. Really, we wanted to use it for X, but I don't see what X is. The Great Game that you were talking about, that was based on nothing too. There are hundreds of years of this stuff, and the Soviets, they've been getting involved of course, we helped to contribute to that, too, the United States specifically, with funding the Mujahideen. But this whole history, the last 200 years, which is effectively what we've been describing, we've had these conversations recently, we've been talking about it like 50 years, 30 years, that kind of thing. But really, you're right, it's 200 years. The great game of the 19th century was about Afghanistan and India, like exactly what you were talking about. That was the great game, the geopolitical contest and conflict of the time. From Afghanistan's perspective, I want to close it out with this. Do you think that a Taliban-run Afghanistan or Afghanistan under any ownership in the near or mid-future has any hope of being anything other than a place for a peace on a chessboard? In other words, is it just going to be the case that in a couple decades, we or somebody else, some other country decides to get involved because it would keep Russia from invading India, even though they aren't planning on doing it? Is there any hope in that deeper sense, Matthew?
I don't think so. Unfortunately, I don't think so for the Afghans. And Afghanistan is in a very precarious place right now. We will see, and a lot of it determines what the United States will be determined by what the United States chooses to do in the next months and years. Many of the warlords in Afghanistan allied themselves with the Taliban, switched over, allied themselves with the Taliban. However, some of the warlords fled, including some of the major warlords like Marshal Dostum and Mohammed Atta-Nur fled the country and are claiming that they are raising their armies to come back and take what is theirs, which is how they view it. They're warlords. They view it as what is theirs. These are brutal, brutal men. What the United States chooses to do, whether they back these warlords or hold their nose and accept the Taliban, will determine the immediate future, the next decade or however long for Afghanistan. But it will be this chessboard, this many people in Washington, D.C. and in London, see the world as a game of risk. The idea of what the heck were we doing in Afghanistan all these years really is, I think, no different than to what the Romans stated they were often doing with their empire, for the glory of the emperor, for the glory of Rome. This is very. I know that the analogy between the United States and Rome is very, for decades now has been trotted out and it's cliche at this point, but I think there's a lot to it. When you look at what the heck were we doing in Afghanistan, what the heck are we doing in these other nations? You come to there are multiple things. People are making a ton of money off of this. We have alliances with these warlords that go back decades, on and on and on. However, it comes to me to really be about, this is simply about, either not just the maintenance, but the expansion of the American empire, and the reasons for that maintenance and expansion have to do with the prestige, the credibility of the White House.
Matthew, speculate for me before we leave, just 30 seconds. What happens from here? Do you think the U.S. backs one of the warlords in a putsch on Afghanistan to push back against the Taliban? Or do you think they accept this kind of Taliban rule? It seems that many of the other countries, China, Russia, et cetera, are extending some level of diplomatic overtures to the country. What do you think happens from here going in, let's say, the next month or two?
Well, I think you're already seeing American commentators, politicians saying if we're not in Afghanistan, the Chinese will be. Whether or not that means the United States will try and violently remove the Taliban from power, or they will they will accept the Taliban, and it is to be seen. I think it's going to be very difficult for for President Biden to want. I don't think that President Biden and White House have any interest in seeing a Taliban delegation arrive in New York City to take seats at the United Nations. The political circus that would result from that, and how that will be used by the Republican Party in the midterms, if not the general election of 2024. Right? I think everything that happens with regards to the United States that will have an extreme and important influence on Afghanistan and determine what happens to the Afghan has everything to do with American domestic politics and very little to do with actual the realities of Central Asia, like whether it's a Chinese boogeyman, whether it's people waving the bloody shirt over 9/11, the domestic political concerns will drive it. And what the Biden administration chooses to do, at this point, unfortunately, because of the complete catastrophe that has occurred in Afghanistan with this withdrawal. And I'll say that the scenes at the Kabul airport were entirely a making of the United States. The United States did not have to evac its embassy, did not have to have this panic at the airport because of that. But because of those scenes, because of the heat that Joe Biden has taken, I am afraid that the United States will continue to be a belligerent in Afghanistan rather than accepting defeat and then doing something to try and assist the Afghans for once, because the United States has never done anything to assist the Afghans. It's always been about the United States. If some Afghans picked up some crumbs, well, then that's okay. But, because if you have a peace, if you have a ceasefire there, if you have an end to the cycle of violence, then perhaps you have a chance to rebuild and reconcile in Afghanistan. And I hope that is the path that the United States chooses, though I'm not very optimistic about that.
I want to go back to one of your personal, like you said, you were asked to come in and then you yourself left. You resigned after seeing the escalation, seeing the point of this stuff. This was like you were saying, it seems, and I'm taking this partly based on completely on what you said. Bush had been effectively sitting on it. Bush's administration had effectively been ignoring the problem. Obama's administration came in, you have a wave of new people, set of fresh eyes, they look at the problem, and they decide to do this surge, this anti-insurgency policy, basically solidifying the stability of the government, something like that. I'm making my case, making their case for them, something like that. Why did he do that? Because he could have pulled out at that moment. Why do you think Obama, I don't, it doesn't have to be just psychoanalysis, because you are familiar with the institutions at work and how they think about these things. Why wouldn't they choose to pull out at that point? You're years into it. The point of it isn't exactly clear. If it's not about nation building in an ethical or moral sense, it's clearly at this point very realpolitik about keeping that government functioning, keeping it from being taken over by the Taliban. That was the baseline of what we were trying to do. But why at that point? Who are we? It's not like Obama was trying to reconcile with the Russians. There wasn't really we hadn't pivoted to Asia yet. Who are we fighting against there other than the Taliban? What was the point of it?
Well, and then you can make the point even after 2009, 2011, when Osama bin Laden is killed. Why then? But I think, it comes down to, and this is just not me saying this, you all brought up the Washington Post Afghan papers, and that's the Washington Post's opinion after looking at 428 interviews by U.S. officials, all senior officials or fairly senior officials who were involved with the war, and coming away with this understanding that it was just one structured lie from start to finish. The Washington Post concludes as well that this war was conducted for the primary purpose of the political aspirations of U.S. presidents. That's it. That you cannot explain it any other way, and I agree with that. I think Barack Obama campaigns against John McCain, declaring Afghanistan the good war as opposed to Iraq the bad war. He comes into office, and I think his advisors immediately see the appeal of a wartime president, something that Karl Rove, George W. Bush's political advisor, spoke about, and the idea that this president, who is a Democrat and also the first black man elected to be president of the United States, can be a better warrior than George Bush and the Republicans were. Very attractive, very much in the so I think it's that. I think it's this this desire for military victory for the sake of the White House. And
very interesting, and that makes perfect sense. We're out of time.
Yeah.
Matthew, thank you so much for joining us. Hopefully we can talk about all this again with you soon. Great talking.
You bet. Thanks for having me on, guys.
And for everybody listening, that was Matthew Ho, nearly 12 years of experience with American wars overseas with the United States Marine Corps, Department of Defense, and State Department. He resigned in protest from his post in Afghanistan with the State Department over the American escalation of the war. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Great show today. Coming back tomorrow, 7 a.m. Eastern, signing off Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. See you on the other side.